Just as I was losing hope, I spotted what looked like a cave entrance tucked into the side of a rocky cliff face. I practically ran towards it, desperate for any kind of shelter. As I approached, I noticed some odd markings around the entrance, almost like claw marks, but much larger than any bear or mountain lion could make. I hesitated for a moment, but the wind was picking up and I could see storm clouds rolling in. I didn't have much choice. I clicked on my headlamp and cautiously entered the cave. It was surprisingly deep, stretching back at least 30 or 40 feet. The floor was smooth and dry, which was a relief. I started setting up my sleeping bag near the entrance, figuring I'd at least have some warning if any animals decided to come investigate during the night. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound coming from the back of the cave. My blood ran cold. I slowly turned my headlamp towards the noise, dreading what I might see. There, crouched in the shadows, was the largest creature I've ever laid eyes on. It was easily 8 feet tall, even hunched over, and covered in thick, matted fur. Its face was almost human-like, but with a prominent brow and wide, expressive eyes that reflected the light of my headlamp. I completely froze. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Could it really be a Bigfoot? I'd always thought they were just myths, campfire stories. But here was this massive, ape-like creature, real as could be, staring right at me. To my shock, it didn't charge or roar. It just watched me. Its eyes were intelligent, curious even. After what felt like an eternity, it slowly raised one massive hand, palm out, in what I can only describe as a calming gesture. I don't know what possessed me, but I found myself mirroring the action, raising my own hand. The creature tilted its head, studying me. Then, to my utter amazement, it let out a soft, almost melodic sound. It wasn't speech exactly, but it didn't seem random either. It was trying to communicate. Slowly, carefully, I lowered myself to sit on my sleeping bag, never taking my eyes off the creature. It remained where it was, but seemed to relax slightly. We stayed like that for what must have been hours, just watching each other. As the night wore on, exhaustion started to take over. I was terrified to sleep, but I couldn't keep my eyes open. The last thing I remember seeing before drifting off was the creature settling down as well, curling up in its corner of the cave. I woke with a start as sunlight started to filter into the cave. For a moment, I thought it had all been a crazy dream. But then I saw the massive footprints in the dirt near the back of the cave. The creature itself was gone, having slipped out sometime during the night. I packed up my gear in a daze, my mind reeling from what had happened. As I was about to leave, something caught my eye. There, near where the creature had been sitting, was a small pile of berries and what looked like some kind of herb or plant. Had it left those for me? I made my way back to the trail in a state of shock. I've spent the last 6 months trying to make sense of what happened that night. I've read every bit of Bigfoot lore I could get my hands on, but nothing quite matches my experience. The creature I encountered wasn't the aggressive, terrifying monster from the stories. It was intelligent, gentle even. The way it tried to communicate, the food it left behind, it showed a level of cognition I never would have expected. I've gone back to that area several times since then, hoping to catch another glimpse or find some evidence. But the cave seems to have vanished. I can't find it no matter how hard I look. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember those eyes, so full of wisdom and curiosity, and I know it was real. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told me this story. But I know what I experienced. There's something out there in the wilderness, something we don't understand. And it's not the mindless beast we've made it out to be in our stories and legends. I've never felt more alive than I did that night, sharing a small space with a creature that by all rights shouldn't exist. It was terrifying, yes, but also awe-inspiring. I felt like I was witnessing something ancient and profound, a secret the modern world has all but forgotten. The encounter has changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I find myself looking at the natural world differently now, always wondering what other mysteries might be hiding just out of sight. I'm more cautious in the wilderness, but also more reverent. I've told a few close friends about what happened, but most just laugh it off or look at me like I'm crazy. That's why I'm sharing it here. I need to get it out, to tell someone who might understand or have had similar experiences. To whoever's reading this, keep an open mind when you're out there in the wild. There's more to this world than we know, and sometimes the things we fear the most turn out to be the most remarkable. I'll never forget that night in the cave and the gentle giant who shared it with me. It's a reminder that there's still magic and mystery in this world if we're brave enough to look for it. Story 2. We were about halfway home, driving through a particularly desolate stretch of road bordered by dense forest on both sides. Selvin was focused on driving, and I was half dozing in the passenger seat when suddenly the headlights illuminated something ahead that made my blood run cold. At first I thought it was just a shadow or trick of the light, but as we got closer, I realized with growing horror that there was an enormous dark figure crossing the road directly in front of us. "Selvin, watch out!" I screamed, jolting fully awake. He slammed on the brakes, and the tires screeched as we skidded to a stop. The creature was so massive that it cleared the entire two-lane road in just 2 or 3 gigantic strides. For a split second, it was fully illuminated in the headlights, and I got a clear look at it. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. This thing was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark, shaggy fur, and it had long arms that hung down almost to its knees. The torso was incredibly broad and muscular. But the most unsettling thing was that it didn't seem to have a distinct neck. The head just kind of blended into the shoulders. As it passed in front of us, it briefly turned its head, and I caught a glimpse of its face. The features were simultaneously human-like and alien. The eyes reflected red in the headlights for just a moment before it disappeared into the woods on the other side of the road. The whole encounter lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like time stood still. As soon as it vanished into the darkness, Selvin and I both started freaking out. "What the hell was that?" he yelled, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. I don't know," I stammered. My heart was racing, and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. "It looked like some kind of monster or something." "That's impossible," Selvin said, but his voice was shaky. "It must have been a bear, a really big bear." But we both knew that wasn't true. No bear moves like that creature did, crossing the road in just a couple strides. And bears don't have those long, dangling arms or that weird necklace head shape. We sat there in shocked silence for a few minutes, too scared to keep driving, but also terrified of staying put. Eventually, Selvin slowly eased the car forward. We drove the rest of the way home in tense silence, constantly scanning the sides of the road for any sign of the creature. When we got back to my house, neither of us wanted to be alone. We ended up sitting in Selvin's car in my driveway until the sun came up, jumping at every little sound and movement in the shadows. We tried to rationalize what we had seen. Maybe it was just a really tall person in a costume, or some kind of escaped zoo animal. But deep down, we both knew it was something else entirely. In the light of day, it all seemed so surreal. We agreed not to tell anyone about what happened, worried they would think we were crazy or on drugs or something. But that creature haunted my dreams for months afterwards. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the image of those glowing red eyes seared into my mind. As the years went by, Selvin and I drifted apart like most high school couples do. We never really talked about that night again, but I know it affected him as deeply as it did me. I tried my best to forget about it and move on with my life, but I never could shake the memory completely. It wasn't until over a decade later that I finally found the courage to talk about what happened. I stumbled across an ad for a Bigfoot research symposium being held in Columbus, and something compelled me to go. As I sat there listening to other people share their encounters, I realized I wasn't alone. So many of their stories echoed elements of what Selvin and I had experienced that night. When I finally stood up and shared our story publicly for the first time, it was like a weight lifted off my chest. People believed me. They didn't think I was crazy, and many of them had seen the exact same type of creature I described. That symposium opened my eyes to a whole hidden world I never knew existed. I started reading every book I could find on Bigfoot and other cryptids. I joined online forums and support groups for eyewitnesses, and slowly but surely, I pieced together more information about what Selvin and I had encountered that night. Based on the location and description, it seems we had a run-in with the infamous Ohio grassman, a Bigfoot-type creature that has been spotted in that region for decades. The glowing eyes, massive size, and distinctive body shape all match up with other reported sightings. Learning more about it has helped me process the trauma of that night, but it's also left me with so many unanswered questions. What exactly was that creature? Where did it come from and where did it go? Are there more of them out there? To this day, I still get chills when I drive down dark, wooded roads at night. A part of me is always scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that hulking shape emerge from the shadows. I know the chances of ever seeing it again are slim, but the memory of that encounter is seared into my mind forever. I often wonder if Selvin still thinks about that night too. We haven't spoken in years, but I hope he's found some peace with what happened. As for me, I've mostly come to terms with it. But there's still a small part of me that lies awake at night sometimes, remembering those few seconds that changed my entire perception of reality. I know a lot of people probably won't believe my story, and that's okay. I'm not here to convince anyone. I'm just sharing my experience in the hopes that it might resonate with others who have seen something they can't explain. If nothing else, I hope it serves as a reminder to keep an open mind. There are things in this world that defy easy explanation or categorization. Sometimes truth really is stranger than fiction. That night in 1983 shattered my understanding of what was possible and opened my eyes to a hidden world most people never glimpse. It was terrifying and awe-inspiring in equal measure, and while a part of me wishes I could forget it ever happened, I'm also strangely grateful for the experience. It taught me that there's so much we don't understand about the world around us, and it gave me a profound appreciation for the mysteries that still exist, even in our modern age. So if you're ever driving down a lonely road late at night, keep your eyes open. You never know what you might see in those fleeting moments between the darkness and the light. Just be prepared. Some things once seen can never be unseen, and they might just change your life forever. Story 3. It was a typical evening at first. I was relaxing on the porch of my little farmhouse after a long day of work, enjoying the crisp autumn air with my loyal companion, a big chow-chow named Buddy. He was sprawled out at my feet as usual, dozing contentedly. As darkness fell, an unsettling quiet settled over the property. The normal nighttime sounds of crickets and frogs had gone eerily silent. I noticed Buddy's ears perk up, his head lifting as he stared intently into the tree line about 50 yards away. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" I asked, peering into the shadows. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but a prickle of unease ran down my spine. Buddy was usually pretty mellow, so his sudden alertness put me on edge. That's when the smell hit me. It was the most putrid, gag-inducing stench I'd ever encountered, like a cocktail of rotting meat, raw sewage and sulfur. I gagged and covered my nose with my shirt, eyes watering. "Jesus Christ," I muttered, looking around for the source. Had something crawled under the porch and died? Buddy was on his feet now, hackles raised as he continued to growl at the woods. I stood up, straining my eyes to see what had him so riled up. The pitch-black forest revealed nothing. I was about to head inside to grab a flashlight when I heard it. Heavy, rhythmic thuds coming from just beyond the tree line. Footsteps, but not like any animal I'd ever heard before. These were bipedal steps, slow and deliberate, with a weight behind them that made the ground seem to vibrate. My blood ran cold as I realized whatever was making those footsteps had to be massive, way bigger than a person. Buddy's growls turned to terrified whimpers as he pressed against my legs, trembling. I stood frozen in place, heart pounding in my chest as the footsteps drew closer. They stopped just inside the tree line, hidden in shadow. I could feel eyes on me, watching intently. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. For several long, agonizing minutes, nothing moved. The silence was deafening. I barely dared to breathe, afraid any sound might provoke whatever was out there. Suddenly, a sharp crack rang out from the woods, like a thick branch being snapped in two. Buddy yelped and bolted for the door, scratching frantically to be let in. I didn't hesitate to follow, practically falling over myself as I fumbled with the doorknob and slammed it behind us. Inside, I paced nervously by the window, peering out into the darkness. The putrid smell had followed us in somehow, filling the house with its nauseating stench. Buddy cowered under the kitchen table, still whimpering softly. I debated calling the police, but what would I even say? I hadn't actually seen anything. They'd probably think I was some drunk making things up. So I just waited, every muscle tense, straining to hear any sound from outside. After what felt like hours, I heard those heavy footsteps again. They circled the house slowly, pausing occasionally. I held my breath each time they stopped near a window, terrified of what I might see if I looked out. Eventually, the steps retreated back towards the woods. The overpowering stench gradually faded. As the first light of dawn broke, the familiar sounds of birds and insects returned. Whatever had been out there was gone. I spent the next day in a daze, exhausted from a sleepless night and still shaken to my core. I searched the property for tracks or other signs, but found nothing conclusive, just some broken branches and a few odd depressions in the soft ground near the tree line. I tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of bizarre hallucination brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew what I'd experienced was real. Something had been out there that night. Something big, something that walked on two legs, something that didn't belong in this world. In the weeks that followed, I installed motion-activated lights and cameras around the property. I started locking the doors religiously and keeping a loaded shotgun by the bed. Buddy refused to go outside after dark anymore. I never saw or heard the creature again, but the memory of that night haunts me to this day. Sometimes when the wind blows just right, I catch a faint whiff of that horrific odor on the breeze. And I know, whatever it was, it's still out there somewhere in those woods. I've thought about moving away countless times over the years, but this land has been in my family for generations. I can't bring myself to leave it behind. So I stay, always watching the tree line, always listening for those heavy footsteps in the night. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. Hell, some days I can barely believe it myself. But I know what I experienced that night was real, and I live with the constant knowledge that it could return at any time. To this day, I've never felt truly safe in my own home again. Every unexplained sound, every shadow in the corner of my eye sets my heart racing. I find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, especially after dark. I've done some research over the years, trying to make sense of what happened. I've read about other encounters people have had in these parts, stories of giant ape-like creatures lurking in the wilderness. Some call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I don't know what to call it, but I know it's out there. I've thought about reaching out to researchers or reporters, but I always stop myself. I don't want the attention, don't want to be labeled as the local kook. So I've kept this to myself all these years, carrying the weight of that terrifying night alone. But lately, I've been hearing whispers around town. Other folks reporting strange noises in the woods, livestock going missing, that same god-awful stench. It makes me wonder if maybe it's time to finally speak up, to warn others about what's out there. For now, though, I just try to go about my days as normally as possible. But every night as darkness falls, I find myself glancing nervously at the woods beyond my property line. And I wonder, is it out there right now, watching and waiting? Will I hear those heavy footsteps again someday? I don't know if I'll ever have answers to what really happened that night. But I do know that it changed me forever. I no longer see the world the same way. I know now that there are things out there beyond our understanding, things that defy explanation. So I'll keep watching, keep listening, and hope that whatever it was stays deep in the forest where it belongs. Because if it ever decides to venture out again, to pay another late-night visit, well, I'm not sure I could handle reliving that terror a second time. All I can do is stay vigilant and hope that by sharing my story, maybe someone else out there won't have to go through what I did. If you're ever in these parts, especially after dark, stay alert. Watch the shadows. And if you catch a whiff of that ungodly stench, run, and don't look back. Story 4. I was 17 years old in the summer of 1991, living in Canton, Ohio. My girlfriend and I had gotten into a huge fight, and I was feeling angry and rebellious. In a moment of teenage angst, I decided to go camping alone in the woods outside of town to clear my head. Looking back now, I realize how foolish and dangerous that decision was. I packed up my old tent, sleeping bag, and some basic supplies, and drove out to a secluded spot in the forest about an hour from Canton. It was a warm August evening as I set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. At first, I felt a sense of freedom being out there on my own. I built a campfire, roasted some hot dogs, and tried to relax under the stars. As night fell, the woods grew eerily quiet, except for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle in the underbrush. I climbed into my tent around 11 p.m. and tried to get some sleep, but I felt on edge being out there alone in the darkness. Every snapping twig or gust of wind made me jump. I must have dozed off eventually, because I suddenly jolted awake around 2 a.m. to the sound of something crashing through the forest nearby. My heart started racing as I heard heavy footsteps circling my campsite, along with deep grunting noises unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I was paralyzed with fear, lying stock still in my sleeping bag and hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps seemed to be getting closer. Then I heard a blood-curdling scream pierce the night air. It sounded almost human, but distorted and primeval. My blood ran cold. Panicked, I fumbled for my flashlight with shaking hands. I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer out into the pitch-black forest. The beam of my flashlight swept across the trees, and for a split second I saw something that made my heart stop. About 50 feet away, illuminated in the flashlight beam, was a massive, fur-covered creature. It was at least 7 feet tall, with long arms and a distinctly ape-like face. But this was no normal ape. Its eyes glowed red in the light, and its mouth was filled with sharp fangs. It let out another bone-chilling howl before loping off into the darkness on 2 legs. I've never moved so fast in my life. I scrambled out of the tent, leaving everything behind, and sprinted to my car. I peeled out of there, tires squealing, heart pounding out of my chest. The whole drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, terrified that thing was going to come bounding out of the woods after me. When I got home, I burst through the door in hysterics, waking up my parents. They thought I was drunk or on drugs at first. Between sobs, I tried to explain what I'd seen, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They assumed I'd just gotten spooked camping alone and had a vivid nightmare. The next day, still shaken to my core, I convinced 2 of my friends to go back to the campsite with me to retrieve my abandoned gear. I needed to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. We arrived at the clearing in the late afternoon. My tent was still there, but it had been shredded to pieces. There were huge bare footprints in the mud all around the campsite. My friends were freaked out, but tried to explain it away as a bear attack. As we hurriedly packed up what was left of my gear, we all froze at the sound of rustling in the trees nearby. Then we heard that same blood-curdling scream echo through the forest, sending chills down my spine. My friends' faces went white. We ran to the car and got the hell out of there. To this day, I've never been able to explain what I encountered in those woods. I know it wasn't a bear or any other normal animal. The glowing eyes, the massive upright stance, the inhuman howls. It was like something out of a nightmare. For years afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. Every noise in the night would send me into a panic, thinking that creature had somehow followed me home. I never went camping again. I've done a lot of research over the years trying to make sense of what I saw. The closest thing I can compare it to is the legendary Bigfoot. But this was no gentle forest dweller. It was a predator, and I'm convinced it would have torn me to shreds if I hadn't escaped when I did. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has had similar encounters in those woods outside Canton. Part of me wants to go back someday to investigate further. But the memory of those glowing red eyes and ear-splitting howls still haunts me. Whatever that thing was, I hope I never cross paths with it again. I know this story sounds unbelievable. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. But I swear on everything I hold dear that this is the absolute truth of what happened to me that terrifying night in the Ohio wilderness. It shook me to my very core and changed how I see the world. There are things out there in the dark that defy explanation, things that most people, thankfully, will never encounter. But I did, and the memory of it will stay with me forever. In the years since, I've grappled with whether or not to share this story publicly. Part of me has always wanted to warn others about what lurks in those woods. But I was afraid of being labeled as crazy or attention-seeking. Even my own parents didn't fully believe me at the time. It's only now, decades later, that I feel compelled to finally open up about my experience. I'm not looking for fame or notoriety. I simply want to add my voice to the small but growing chorus of people who have encountered inexplicable, terrifying things in the wilderness. If nothing else, I hope my story serves as a cautionary tale. Nature can be beautiful and awe-inspiring, but it can also be deadly and mysterious. There are forces and creatures out there that we don't understand. So please, be careful out there. Don't make the same reckless mistake I did as a foolish teenager. To this day, I can't drive past densely wooded areas without getting a chill down my spine. The sound of twigs snapping in the forest makes my hair stand on end. And I never ever go anywhere remote without multiple people and ample protection. Some wounds heal with time, but the psychological scars from that night have stayed with me. It fundamentally altered how I perceive the world and my place in it. We are not alone out there, and we are not always at the top of the food chain. I don't know if what I encountered was a Bigfoot, some undiscovered species, or something even stranger. But I know with absolute certainty that it was real, it was terrifying, and it was unlike anything known to science. So the next time you're in the woods and hear an unexplained sound in the darkness, remember my story. And maybe think twice before dismissing it as just the wind or your imagination playing tricks, because sometimes the monsters are real. Story 5. I'll never forget that day in December 1999. The memories are seared into my mind, haunting me even now. I was visiting my grandma in rural Ohio for the holidays. She lived alone in an old farmhouse, surrounded by dense woods. I always loved going there as a kid, but this trip would change everything. It was a crisp winter afternoon. Grandma had just finished cooking lunch and asked me to take out the food scraps to the compost pile at the edge of the woods. It was something she did regularly, tossing out vegetable peelings, eggshells, that sort of thing. I grabbed the bucket and headed out, my breath visible in the cold air. As I approached the tree line, an eerie stillness settled over the area. The birds had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to die down. Every instinct told me something wasn't right, but I shrugged it off and kept walking. I had just dumped out the scraps when movement caught my eye. About 50 feet away, partially hidden in the shadows of the trees, stood the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders that made it look almost as wide as it was tall. Its skin was jet black, blending into the darkness around it. But what struck me most were the eyes, piercing yellow orbs that seemed to glow as they stared directly at me. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be human. It was far too large and oddly proportioned. A bear, maybe. But bears don't stand upright like that. As I stared, trying to process it, the creature shifted slightly. Twigs and branches snapped loudly under its weight. That sound jolted me out of my paralysis. I dropped the bucket and ran back towards the house as fast as I could, not daring to look behind me. I burst through the door, slamming it shut and locking it. I was shaking uncontrollably, gasping for air. "Grandma!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "There's something out there. Some kind of monster or something." To my shock, she didn't seem alarmed at all. She calmly set down her knitting and asked, "Did you see it clearly? How big was it?" I described what I'd seen, growing more confused by her lack of reaction. When I finished, she just nodded slowly. "I was wondering when you might run into him," she said softly. "He's been coming around for years now." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You know about this thing? What is it? Why didn't you warn me?" She sighed. "I'm not entirely sure what he is. Some kind of wild man, I suppose. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. He started showing up not long after your grandpa passed. I think the food scraps attracted him at first, but he's never caused any harm." My mind was reeling. This couldn't be real. Bigfoot wasn't real, but I knew what I saw out there. And apparently, my grandmother had been casually coexisting with this creature for years. But how? Why haven't you told anyone? Called the police or scientists or something? I sputtered. She gave me a stern look. "And have them come traipsing all over my property, scaring him off or worse. No, he has as much right to be here as we do. We've come to an understanding over the years. I leave out food. He stays out of my garden. Simple as that." I spent the rest of the day in a daze, peeking out windows, jumping at every sound. As night fell, my nerves were frayed. I begged Grandma to come back to town with me, but she refused. Said she wasn't leaving her home because of my overreaction. Around midnight, unable to sleep, I crept downstairs for a glass of water. As I passed the kitchen window, movement outside caught my eye. My blood ran cold as I saw the massive shape of the creature, illuminated by moonlight. It was standing at the edge of the yard, watching the house. Those yellow eyes seemed to bore into me, even from a distance. I stumbled backwards, knocking over a chair. The noise must have startled it, because when I looked again, it was gone. But I swear, I could hear heavy footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I practically begged Grandma to at least let me install some security cameras or something. But she was adamant. She didn't want anything to change. "He was here long before us, and he'll be here long after we're gone," she said firmly. "We're guests in his woods, not the other way around." I left that afternoon, shaken to my core. I've struggled to make sense of what happened ever since. I've researched countless Bigfoot sightings and theories, but nothing quite matches what I experienced. The sheer size of it, the intelligence in those eyes, it was like nothing I've ever encountered. Part of me wants to go back, to try and capture evidence, but a bigger part is terrified of seeing that thing again. And honestly, I'm not sure the world is ready for proof of its existence. Maybe my grandma had the right idea all along. Live and let live. I still call her every week to check in. She always assures me everything is fine. Sometimes I hear noises in the background, heavy footsteps, branches snapping. She brushes off my concerns, but I know he's still out there, watching, waiting. For what? I'm not sure. But I'll never forget those eyes, or the primal fear I felt in that moment. It changed me forever. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. If the stress of the holidays and isolation of my grandma's farm caused some kind of hallucination. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. There are things in this world beyond our understanding. I just hope they stay in the shadows where they belong. Story 6. I was just a kid back in '66, but I remember that summer like it was yesterday. The whole town of Clarence was on edge, and for good reason. It all started when some guys from the gas company came into town talking about seeing something weird out in the woods. At first, we all thought they were just pulling our legs or had too much to drink, but then more and more people started coming forward with their own stories. I remember overhearing my parents talking in hushed voices late one night. My dad worked for the gas company too, and he'd been out there with the crew when it happened. He told my mom that they were just doing a routine check on some pipelines when Jim, one of the guys, let out this blood-curdling scream. Everyone turned to look, and there it was, this massive hairy thing running between the trees. Dad said it was easily as big as a man, maybe bigger, but moved like nothing he'd ever seen before. The next day, it was all anyone could talk about. The adults tried to keep us kids from hearing too much, but you know how it is in a small town. Word spreads fast. Some people were saying it was just a bear, but others swore up and down it was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. Things started getting really weird after that. Old Mrs. Johnson, who lived on the outskirts of town, came into the general store one morning in hysterics. Her entire chicken coop had been destroyed overnight. We're not talking about a fox getting in and nabbing a couple birds. The whole structure was torn apart like it was made of matchsticks, and the chickens, gone, every last one of them. But it wasn't just Mrs. Johnson. Every few days, someone else would have a story. Mr. Parker's dog went missing, and a few days later he swears he saw a huge, hairy creature carrying something that looked like his poor old Rover in its arms. The Millers said they woke up one night to the sound of something huge crashing around in their backyard, but when Mr. Miller went to check with his shotgun, whatever it was had vanished. The smell was what got to me the most. It was this overpowering, musky odor that would drift through town on the night breeze. It was like nothing I'd ever smelled before, not quite animal, not quite human. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up every time I caught a whiff of it. Things came to a head about a month after the first sighting. The mayor called a town meeting at the community center. I begged my parents to let me go, but they made me stay home with my little sister. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to hear what was going on next door at the center, but I could only catch snippets. The next morning, I cornered my best friend Tommy, whose dad was on the town council. He filled me in on what he'd overheard. Apparently, nearly half the town had some kind of story to share. People were scared, angry and confused. Some wanted to organize a hunting party to track down whatever this thing was. Others thought we should call in state authorities or even the military. I remember Tommy's eyes going wide as he told me about one guy who stood up and said he'd been seeing these creatures, yes, more than one, for years. He claimed they'd always been in the forests around Clarence, but as more land got cleared for development, they were being forced closer to town. For weeks after that meeting, you couldn't go anywhere without seeing groups of men with rifles heading into the woods. Kids weren't allowed to play outside after dark anymore. Everyone was on high alert. But here's the thing. Despite all the searches, all the traps set, all the vigilance, no one ever caught this thing. No one ever got a clear picture or found any concrete evidence. Just more sightings, more destroyed property, more of that awful smell. As summer turned to fall, the sightings started to taper off. By winter, it was almost like it had never happened. Almost. But you could still see it in people's eyes when they looked at the tree line. You could hear it in the way parents called their kids in a little earlier each evening. Something had changed in Clarence, and we all knew it. Years later, when I was in college, I came across an article about Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. As I read about the descriptions of the creature, the destroyed campsites, the strange sounds in the night, it all came flooding back. That summer in Clarence, the fear, the excitement, the mystery of it all. I've never been able to fully explain what happened in my hometown that summer. Was it mass hysteria? Some kind of elaborate hoax? Or was there really something out there in the woods, something that didn't want to be found? All I know is that to this day, whenever I visit my parents back in Clarence and take a walk near the woods at dusk, I can't help but feel eyes watching me from the shadows. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a whiff of that strange, musky odor on the breeze, and all those old memories come rushing back. I don't know if I'll ever have answers about what really happened that summer, but I do know this. Whatever it was, it changed our town forever. And for those of us who lived through it, the mystery of that creature in the woods will always be a part of us, lingering just at the edge of our memories, like a shadow we can never quite catch. Story 7. It was a warm night in May 2015, and I was sitting on my back porch in Wellston, Ohio, enjoying the quiet evening. The crickets were chirping, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. Little did I know that this peaceful night would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I've lived in this house for over 20 years, and I know every inch of my property like the back of my hand. That's why what happened next shook me to my core. It was close to midnight, and I was about to head inside when I noticed something moving in the shadows at the edge of my yard. At first, I thought it might be a deer. We get them wandering through occasionally, so I didn't think much of it. But as I squinted to get a better look, I realized this was no deer. The shape was all wrong, and it was moving in a way that sent chills down my spine. As it stepped into a patch of moonlight, I felt my heart stop. This thing had legs that were impossibly long. I'm talking at least 5 feet, probably more. They were thick and muscular, covered in dark hair. The rest of its body was massive too, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there, frozen in fear, as this creature strode across my property with long, purposeful steps. It moved with an eerie grace, almost gliding across the ground despite its size. The worst part was when it turned its head and looked directly at me. I swear those eyes glowed in the darkness, reflecting the moonlight like some kind of predator. For a split second, our gazes locked, and I felt a primal fear unlike anything I've ever experienced. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. It disappeared into the tree line at the far end of my property, leaving me shaking and questioning my sanity. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying the scene in my head, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, or that it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. The next day, I went out to investigate. I half expected to find giant footprints or broken branches, some kind of evidence that would prove I wasn't going crazy. But there was nothing. The grass was undisturbed, and the woods looked exactly as they always had. I spent the next few weeks on edge, jumping at every sound and constantly scanning the tree line. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. But then, a memory from a few years earlier came flooding back, and I realized this wasn't the first time I had encountered something unexplainable. It was back in 2012, on a crisp autumn evening. I was taking my usual walk along the old railroad tracks that run behind my property. It's a route I've taken hundreds of times, and I've never felt unsafe there. I remember the sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the tracks. I was about halfway through my walk when I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. About 300 yards ahead of me, standing directly on the railroad tracks, was a figure. At first, I thought it was just another person out for a walk, but as I focused on it, I realized something was very wrong. This figure was tall, much taller than any person I've ever seen. It was just standing there, completely still. I couldn't make out any details at that distance, but its silhouette was unmistakably inhuman. The strangest part was that it seemed to be watching me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. It was an intense, almost physical sensation that made my skin crawl. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move or look away. The figure never moved either. It just stood there, silent and still, like some kind of sentinel. Finally, I managed to snap out of it. I turned and ran back home as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally worked up the courage to look back, the tracks were empty. The figure had vanished without a trace. I tried to rationalize it at the time. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my imagination running wild. But after what I saw in 2015, I can't deny it anymore. There's something out there, something that defies explanation. These two encounters have changed me. I used to love being outdoors, but now I'm constantly on edge. Every time I step outside, especially at night, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those glowing eyes or that impossibly tall figure. I've done some research since then, trying to find any similar reports in the area. I've come across a few vague stories, whispered accounts of giant, hairy creatures seen in the woods around Wellston, but nothing as clear or as close as what I experienced. Some nights, I lie awake, replaying those encounters in my mind. I wonder what would have happened if the creature had come closer that night on my porch. Or what if I had walked towards that figure on the railroad tracks instead of running away? The rational part of my brain keeps trying to come up with explanations. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe it was just a very tall person playing a prank. But deep down, I know those explanations don't fit. What I saw was something other, something that shouldn't exist in our world, but somehow does. I've thought about setting up cameras around my property, trying to catch evidence of these creatures, but honestly, I'm scared of what I might see. Part of me wants proof, wants to know that I'm not crazy. But another part of me is terrified of confirming that these things are real. Since those encounters, I've become hyper-aware of every sound in the woods, every shadow that moves in the corner of my eye. I've started locking my doors religiously, something I never used to do in this quiet town. I've even considered moving, but this is my home. Why should I have to leave because of something I can't even explain? I'm sharing this story now because I need to know if anyone else has experienced anything similar. Have you seen impossibly tall creatures in the woods around Wellston? Have you felt that sense of being watched by something that shouldn't exist? I don't know what these creatures are. Bigfoot? some kind of undiscovered species, or something even stranger. All I know is that they're out there, and they've changed my life forever. Every day, I look out at those woods and wonder if I'll ever see those creatures again. Part of me hopes I do, just to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But a bigger part of me prays that I never have another encounter like that. The fear, the uncertainty, the way it shakes your entire worldview. It's not something I'd wish on anyone. So if you're ever in Wellston, Ohio, especially at night, keep your eyes open. And if you see something moving in the shadows, something with legs that are just a little too long or a figure that's just a little too tall, don't try to rationalize it. Don't try to get a closer look. Just run, and hope it doesn't decide to follow you. Because once you've seen what's out there, once you know that the world is bigger and stranger than you ever imagined, you can never go back. You'll always be looking over your shoulder, always wondering what might be watching you from the darkness. And trust me, that's no way to live. But at least now I know I'm not alone. Maybe by sharing my story, I can find others who have seen what I've seen. Maybe together, we can make sense of these encounters and find some peace. Because right now, all I have are questions, and the lingering fear that someday I might find the answers whether I want to or not. Story 8. I was out hunting with my buddy Jake near Marietta, Ohio, back in 2013. It was a chilly November morning, and we had set up our tree stands before dawn, hoping to bag a nice buck as rifle season had just opened. As the sun slowly crept above the horizon, casting long shadows through the forest, I kept my eyes peeled for any movement. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional bird call or rustle of leaves. After a few uneventful hours, I was starting to get restless. My legs were stiff from sitting motionless in the cold air. I glanced over at Jake in his stand about 50 yards away. He gave me a little shrug, telling me he hadn't seen anything either. I was just about to suggest we relocate when I caught a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. My heart rate instantly picked up as I slowly turned my head, expecting to see a deer emerging from the brush, but what I saw made my blood run cold. There, moving swiftly between two hills about 200 yards away, was a large, dark figure. At first I thought it might be a bear, but the way it moved was all wrong. It was walking upright on two legs, but with an odd gait, almost like a gorilla walk. Its arms swung exaggeratedly at its sides as it loped along. I blinked hard, not believing what I was seeing. The creature had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. Its head seemed to sit directly on broad, sloping shoulders. There was no visible neck. As I watched in stunned silence, it suddenly stopped and turned its head in our direction. Even from that distance, I could feel its gaze boring into me. A primal fear gripped me, every instinct screaming at me to run. With surprising speed and agility for its size, the creature dropped to all fours and bounded up the opposite hillside, disappearing into the trees within seconds. I sat there frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Did I really just see what I thought I saw? It couldn't be. But what else could explain what I'd witnessed? After a few moments, I heard Jake hissing my name urgently. I looked over to see him frantically gesturing for me to get down. His eyes were wide with fear. On shaky legs, I climbed down from my stand as quietly as I could. Jake met me on the ground, his face pale. Did you see that?" he whispered. I nodded, still unable to find my voice. "What the hell was it?" Jake asked, his voice tight with fear. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "But we need to get out of here, now." We hastily gathered our gear, constantly looking over our shoulders. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made us jump. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. As we hurried back towards my truck, the silence of the forest was oppressive. It felt like every creature was holding its breath, sensing the presence of an apex predator. About halfway back, we heard a loud crash somewhere behind us, like a tree being knocked over. Jake and I looked at each other in terror before breaking into a run. We sprinted the rest of the way, our heavy boots and gear clanking loudly. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. We dove inside, and I cranked the engine, peeling out of there as fast as I dared on the rough logging road. Neither of us spoke for several minutes as I sped us back towards town. The adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, my grip white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "Brandon, what do you think that thing was?" I shook my head, still trying to process what we'd seen. "I don't know, man, but it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I've ever seen before." "You don't think, it couldn't have been a Bigfoot?" Jake asked hesitantly. Under normal circumstances, I would have scoffed at the idea, but after what we'd just experienced, I wasn't so quick to dismiss it. "I don't know what to think," I replied. "All I know is that was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life." We debated whether or not to report the sighting to anyone. In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. Who would believe us anyway? We'd probably just be laughed at or accused of trying to pull a hoax. But I know what I saw that day. The image of that creature is burned into my mind. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, the raw power it exuded. It was like nothing of this world. I've been back to those woods many times since then, always half hoping and half dreading to catch another glimpse. But I've never seen anything like it again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the fear in Jake's eyes, and I know it was real. Whatever that creature was, it made me realize how little we truly know about the world around us. There are things out there beyond our understanding, lurking in the shadows of the wilderness. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just stumble upon them. I still go hunting, but never alone anymore. And I'm always hyper-aware of my surroundings, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The encounter has left me with a deep respect for nature and its mysteries. To this day, I can't explain what Jake and I saw in those Ohio woods, but I know it was real, and it changed my perspective on the world forever. There are things out there we can't explain, creatures that defy logic and science, and sometimes they let themselves be seen, if only for a moment. I often find myself lying awake at night, replaying that day in my mind. The image of that creature moving with impossible speed and grace through the forest. The intelligence and awareness in its eyes as it looked directly at us. The overwhelming sense of fear and awe it inspired. Sometimes I wonder if it was as curious about us as we were about it. Was it studying us, trying to understand these strange creatures invading its territory? Or was it simply passing through, unaware of the profound impact it would have on our lives? I've done a lot of research since that day, reading accounts of other Bigfoot sightings and unexplained creatures. It's surprising how many similar stories are out there from all over the country, people from all walks of life describing encounters that mirror our own. Of course, there are plenty of hoaxes and misidentifications too, but after what I experienced, I'm much more open-minded about these things. I know there are phenomena out there that science hasn't explained yet. Jake and I have talked about that day many times over the years. We've analyzed every detail, trying to make sense of what we saw. But in the end, we always come back to the same conclusion. We encountered something truly extraordinary that day, something that defies easy explanation. The experience has given me a newfound appreciation for the mysteries of the natural world. It's humbling to realize how little we truly know about the creatures we share this planet with. There could be entire species out there, intelligent and elusive, that have managed to avoid detection by modern humans. I still love being out in nature, but I approach it with a different mindset now. More reverence, more caution. I'm always aware that there could be eyes watching from the shadows, belonging to something we don't understand. That day in the Ohio woods changed me forever. It opened my eyes to possibilities I never would have considered before. And while part of me hopes to never encounter such a creature again, another part of me longs for that rush of coming face to face with the unknown. For now, I'll keep telling my story, hoping that others will keep an open mind about the mysteries that surround us. Because sometimes, truth really is stranger than fiction, and you never know when you might find yourself face to face with something that challenges everything you thought you knew about the world. Story 9. I'll never forget that camping trip to Shawnee State Forest back in July 2015. It was supposed to be a fun father-son's adventure with my boys Casey and Riley, along with their friend Owen. We were all excited to spend a few days hiking and exploring the wilderness. But what happened out there in those woods still haunts me to this day. We arrived at the campground on a sunny Friday afternoon and set up our tents in a nice secluded spot surrounded by tall trees. The boys were in high spirits, laughing and joking around as we got everything set up. I fired up the camp stove to make some hot dogs for dinner while the kids gathered firewood. As we sat around the campfire that evening, I noticed Casey kept glancing nervously into the darkening forest. When I asked what was wrong, he hesitated before saying he thought he had seen something weird while collecting wood earlier. It was like a big hairy shape, kind of crouched down behind a tree, he said quietly. But when I looked again, it was gone. I assured him it was probably just a deer or maybe a black bear, though I'll admit the hair on the back of my neck stood up a bit. I told the boys to make sure to stay close to camp and not wander off alone. We turned in fairly early that night, planning to get an early start on a hike the next day. I drifted off to sleep, listening to the chorus of crickets and frogs. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud cracking sound, like a tree branch snapping. My eyes flew open, and I lay completely still, straining my ears. The forest had gone eerily quiet. Then I heard it. A series of sharp knocks, almost like someone hitting a baseball bat against a tree. Knock, knock, knock. A pause. Then 3 more knocks. It seemed to be coming from about 100 yards away. My heart started racing. I told myself it was probably just a woodpecker, but at 2 a.m., and it sounded too loud and deliberate for a bird. I was about to wake the boys when another sound froze me in place. A long, drawn-out whoop echoed through the trees. It started low, then rose in pitch, lasting for several seconds. I had never heard anything like it before. It was distinctly not human, but didn't sound like any animal I recognized either. I lay there for what felt like hours, every muscle tense, listening intently. But I didn't hear anything else out of the ordinary for the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted from lack of sleep, but tried to act normal for the kids' sake. We spent the day hiking some of the forest trails. I found myself constantly scanning the woods around us, half expecting to see some large, hair-covered creature lurking in the shadows. But the day passed uneventfully. That evening, as we sat around the campfire roasting marshmallows, Riley suddenly sat bolt upright, eyes wide. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered. We all fell silent, listening. For a few moments, all I could hear was the crackling of the fire. Then a blood-curdling scream ripped through the night air. It started as a deep roar, then rose to a high-pitched shriek that seemed to go on forever. It sounded like it came from less than a quarter-mile away. Owen dropped his marshmallow stick and scrambled to get behind me. Casey and Riley both had tears in their eyes. I tried to stay calm for their sake, but my hands were shaking as I quickly doused the fire. "Everyone in the tent now," I ordered in a low voice. We huddled together in the larger tent, hardly daring to breathe. I clutched the hunting knife I had brought along, knowing it would be useless against whatever had made that sound. That's when the footsteps started. Heavy, methodical footsteps. bipedal, much too heavy to be human. They seemed to circle our campsite, getting closer, then farther away, then closer again. This went on for at least an hour. At one point, something brushed against the side of the tent, making the thin fabric bulge inward. I thought I could make out the outline of a massive hand. I clamped my own hand over Riley's mouth to stifle his whimper. Eventually, the footsteps faded away into the distance, but none of us slept a wink that night. As soon as it was light enough to see, we hurriedly packed up camp and got the hell out of there. I've never seen the boys move so fast. On the drive home, we tried to make sense of what had happened. None of us could explain it. I've done a lot of research since then on Bigfoot encounters, and so much of what we experienced lines up with other reports. The wood knocks, the whoops, the horrifying scream, the footsteps. I still get chills thinking about that massive hand-like shape pressing against our tent. What would have happened if that thing had decided to come inside? I thank God we made it out of those woods unharmed. We've never gone camping since then. The boys don't even like being outside after dark anymore. I can't blame them. Whatever is out there in Shawnee State Forest, I hope I never encounter it again. But the memory of those 2 terrifying nights will stay with me forever. Story 10. I was visiting my buddy Tom out in Pike County, Ohio, back in October 2017. He's got this little property between Bainbridge and Latham, real rural area, lots of woods and farmland. I'd been hearing some weird stories from Tom about strange stuff going on out there recently. Apparently some of his neighbors had lost dogs in mysterious circumstances, and there were whispers about Bigfoot sightings in those parts. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, every small town has its local legends, right? But Tom seemed pretty shaken up about it all. Said he'd been hearing odd noises at night, finding weird tracks on his land. I figured he was just letting his imagination run wild, what with all the spooky October vibes and whatnot. Anyway, I spent a few days out there helping Tom with some work on his place. My sister-in-law Angela came along too, since she and Tom's wife are good friends. It was a nice little getaway from the city, getting some fresh air and enjoying the fall colors. The night before we were set to head home, Tom and his wife insisted on having a big bonfire. We sat around swapping stories, Tom of course bringing up all the Bigfoot stuff again. I admit, as the night wore on and the woods got real dark around us, I started feeling a bit uneasy. There was just something off about the atmosphere, like we were being watched or something. I kept catching movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing there. Finally, around midnight, we called it a night. Angela and I were staying in Tom's guest room, so we said our goodnights and turned in. I had trouble falling asleep, though. Every little creak of the house settling or rustle of wind in the trees outside had me on edge. I must have dozed off eventually, but I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. to the sound of something moving around outside. I got up and peeked out the window, but it was pitch black out there. I could hear what sounded like heavy footsteps, though, and branches snapping. Way too big to be a deer or coyote. My heart was racing as I strained my eyes trying to make out any shapes in the darkness. After a few tense minutes, the noises faded away. I climbed back in bed, but barely slept a wink the rest of the night. The next morning, I was pretty freaked out, but tried to play it cool. I casually asked Tom if he'd heard anything weird in the night. He got real quiet and just nodded, saying he'd heard it too, but was afraid to look. We did a walk around the property after breakfast and found some huge bare footprints in the mud near the tree line. They were easily 15 inches long and sunk deep into the ground, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. That was enough for me. I was ready to get the hell out of there. Angela and I packed up our stuff and said our goodbyes. Tom warned us to be careful on the drive out, said there had been more sightings lately on that stretch of road between his place and the highway. We set out around dusk, later than I would have liked. The sun was almost down, and long shadows were stretching across the road. I was on high alert, gripping the steering wheel tight as we wound through the heavily wooded area. Angela was pretty quiet too. I could tell she was spooked by everything as well. We'd gone maybe 10 minutes down this lonely back road when suddenly I saw something step out onto the pavement ahead of us. At first I thought it was a bear. It was huge and covered in dark fur. But as we got closer, I realized with growing horror that this thing was walking on 2 legs. I slammed on the brakes and the car skidded to a stop about 50 feet from the creature. In the glare of the headlights, I could see it clearly now. It was massive, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, with long arms that hung down past its knees. The body was barrel-chested and powerfully built, easily 1,000 pounds or more. But it was the face that really got me. It looked almost human-like, with deep-set eyes that reflected red in the light. For a moment we all just froze there, me and Angela sitting terrified in the car, and this thing standing in the road staring right at us. Its expression seemed almost surprised, like it hadn't expected to encounter anyone out here. I could hear Angela whimpering softly beside me, but I couldn't take my eyes off the creature. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, it let out this bone-chilling roar that shook the whole car. Then, in one fluid motion, it turned and bounded off the road, crashing through the underbrush and disappearing into the dark woods. I don't even remember the rest of the drive home. I was in such a state of shock. Angela was full-on crying by that point. When we finally got back to civilization, we pulled into a gas station and just sat there for a while, trying to process what we'd seen. We debated whether to report it to anyone, but who would believe us? I've run it over in my mind 1,000 times since then, wondering if there was any other explanation. But I know what I saw. That was no bear, no guy in a costume. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. I haven't been back to visit Tom since then. He's called a few times, hinting that more weird stuff has been happening out there. But I can't bring myself to go back. Just thinking about that night, about that creature's eyes locked on mine, still gives me chills. I don't know what's out there in those woods. I don't want to know. But I can tell you this. I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. There are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that we're maybe not meant to understand. And sometimes ignorance really is bliss. I still have nightmares about that night. In my dreams, I'm back on that dark road, but this time the creature doesn't run away. It charges the car, smashing through the windshield with those huge, powerful arms. I always wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. Angela and I have barely spoken about it since. It's like we have this unspoken agreement to pretend it never happened, but I can see it in her eyes when we get together for family events. That shared trauma, that knowledge that the world isn't what we thought it was. I've done some research since then, looking into other Bigfoot sightings in the area. There are more than you'd think, going back decades. Some of the descriptions match exactly what we saw. The height, the build, even that eerily human-like face. It makes me wonder how long these things have been out there, hiding just beyond the edges of our civilization. I've thought about reaching out to some of these Bigfoot research groups, sharing my story. But part of me is afraid of stirring things up, of drawing attention to whatever's out there. What if they decided to come looking for me? The thought keeps me up at night sometimes. I've become a bit of a hermit since then, to be honest. I don't go camping anymore. Don't like being out in nature at all, really. My friends think I'm just being paranoid, but they don't know. They can't understand unless they've seen it for themselves. Sometimes I wonder if I'm going crazy. If maybe it was all just some kind of shared hallucination brought on by fear and suggestion. But then I remember the sound of its footsteps, the smell of wet fur and musk that filled the air when it was close to the car. Those aren't things you can imagine. I don't know why I'm sharing all this now. Maybe I just need to get it off my chest, to tell someone who won't immediately dismiss me as a lunatic. Or maybe I'm hoping that someone out there has had a similar experience, that I'm not alone in this. All I know is that the world is a stranger, more mysterious place than we realize. There are things out there in the dark that we can't explain, things that challenge everything we think we know about reality. And once you've seen them, you can never go back to the comfortable ignorance of before. So, if you're ever driving down a lonely road in rural Ohio, or anywhere really, and you see something step out of the woods that doesn't look quite right, don't stop. Don't try to get a closer look. Just keep driving as fast as you can and pray that it doesn't decide to follow you home. Because trust me, there are some things in this world that are better left unseen, and once you've glimpsed them, they never really leave you alone. Story 11. The first couple days were uneventful. We saw a few deer, but nothing worth taking a shot at. On the third morning, we decided to try a new area that Jake had scouted out previously. It was a bit more remote, requiring about an hour's hike from our campsite. As we made our way through the dense forest, I remember feeling a sense of unease, like we were being watched. I brushed it off as just typical hunter's paranoia. We set up in a small clearing that gave us a good vantage point of a hillside where Jake had seen deer tracks. The crisp autumn air nipped at my face as we settled in to wait. Hours passed with no sign of any wildlife. I was starting to get restless and was about to suggest we move to a new spot when Jake suddenly tensed up and grabbed my arm. "Brandon, look," he whispered urgently, pointing towards the top of the hill about 250 meters away. At first I didn't see anything. Then I noticed movement, a large dark figure emerging from the tree line. My initial thought was that it must be a bear, but as I raised my binoculars for a better look, I realized this was something else entirely. The creature was massive, at least 7 feet tall, and covered in dark, matted fur. It moved with an unnatural speed and agility, especially for its size. What struck me most was how it moved. Not on all fours like a bear, but upright on 2 legs. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A guy in a costume, some kind of escaped zoo animal. But deep down, I knew this was something beyond explanation. As I watched in stunned silence, the creature paused and seemed to scan the area. That's when I noticed its face. Not quite human, not quite animal, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with an eerie intelligence. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it was looking in our direction. Suddenly, it started moving again, this time with purpose, straight towards us. Its long strides ate up the distance between us at an alarming rate. Panic set in as I realized we were in serious danger. "Run!" Jake hissed, already scrambling to his feet. I didn't need to be told twice. We abandoned our gear and took off running, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All that mattered was putting distance between us and that thing. I could hear it behind us, branches snapping and undergrowth rustling as it gave chase. The sound spurred me on, pushing my body beyond what I thought possible. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but pure adrenaline kept me going. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we burst out of the woods onto an old logging road. Without discussion, we both turned and sprinted down the dirt path, hoping it would lead us back to civilization. The sounds of pursuit faded, but we didn't slow down until we physically couldn't run anymore. Gasping for air, we finally stopped and looked back. There was no sign of the creature, just the silent, indifferent forest. We were lost, without supplies, and thoroughly shaken. It took us most of the day to find our way back to our campsite, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. We packed up immediately and left, not even bothering to retrieve our abandoned gear. The drive home was tense and quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts about what we'd experienced. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a bear, and our minds played tricks on us in the heat of the moment. But we both knew what we saw. In the weeks that followed, I obsessively researched similar encounters in the area. I found a few vague reports of unexplained sightings, but nothing concrete. Jake refuses to talk about it and won't go hunting anymore. As for me, I haven't set foot in those woods since, and I don't think I ever will again. I still have nightmares about that day. The creature's inhuman speed, those glowing eyes, the primal fear I felt. I don't know what it was, but I know it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in our world. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, roaming those remote hills. And sometimes on quiet nights I swear I can hear something moving in the woods behind my house, watching and waiting. I'm not sure why I'm sharing this now. Maybe I just need someone else to know what happened, to validate that I'm not crazy. Or maybe I'm hoping someone out there has had a similar experience and can help me make sense of it all. All I know is that day changed me forever, and I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. To anyone planning a hunting trip or hike in remote areas, be careful out there. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that shouldn't exist but do. And if you ever find yourself face to face with something you can't explain, don't try to be a hero. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. It might just save your life. Story 12. I've lived on this small farm in Clarence, New York for over 20 years now. It's not much, just a modest house, a barn, and a few acres of land. I keep a small herd of cattle. Well, I used to anyway. Now I'm down to just a single cow after selling off most of the herd last year when times got tough. That cow, Bessie, was special to me. I know it sounds silly, but when you only have one animal left, you get attached. She was a gentle old girl, always coming up to the fence for a scratch behind the ears. And my dog, Max, he loved her too. That scruffy mutt would herd Bessie around the pasture like she was a whole herd. Anyway, it was just a normal Tuesday morning. I got up at dawn like always to start my chores. As I was walking out to the barn, I noticed something was off. The fence to Bessie's pasture was busted open. At first I figured she must have pushed through it somehow, though that didn't seem like her. I called out for her, whistling and clicking my tongue like I always did. Nothing. I started to get worried, thinking maybe she'd wandered off onto the road. That's when I heard Max barking frantically from somewhere in the woods behind the property. I hurried towards the sound, calling out for Max and Bessie both now. The barking was getting more frenzied, almost panicked sounding. My heart was racing as I pushed through the underbrush. What I saw when I got to the clearing still haunts me. There was Bessie, or what was left of her, way up in an old oak tree. I'm talking 30 feet off the ground at least. Her body was torn to pieces, chunks of flesh and organs hanging from branches. Blood was everywhere, dripping down the trunk. The smell hit me like a wall, that sickly sweet copper scent mixed with the stink of her ruptured guts. I stumbled back, falling on my ass as I tried to process what I was seeing. This was impossible. No normal predator could do this. A bear couldn't lift a full-grown cow that high, and the sheer violence of it. This was more than just an animal attack. That's when I realized Max had stopped barking. I called out for him, my voice shaking. Silence. He was just gone, vanished without a trace. I searched that woods for hours but never found a single sign of him. I don't know how long I sat there in shock before I finally pulled myself together enough to call for help. When the sheriff and animal control showed up, they were as baffled as I was. They'd never seen anything like it. It took the fire department to get Bessie's remains down from that tree. As they were working, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. At the base of the tree were footprints, Massive footprints, bigger than any human foot I've ever seen. They were pressed deep into the mud, like whatever made them weighed hundreds of pounds. That's when it hit me. This had to be the work of Bigfoot. I know how crazy that sounds, believe me. I've always scoffed at those Bigfoot stories, but after what I saw, I'm a believer now. You see, there's been a lot of development in our area lately. New housing subdivisions going up, forests being cleared. I think we've been encroaching on Bigfoot's territory, and this was its way of lashing out. A warning to stay away. The authorities didn't want to hear my theories, of course. They wrote it off as a bizarre animal attack, maybe a bear or mountain lion gone berserk. But I know what I saw. Those footprints were unmistakable. For days after, I barely slept. Every little sound outside had me jumping, thinking that thing was coming back to finish the job. I kept imagining poor Max's fate, wondering if he'd suffered. The silence in the barn without Bessie's familiar lowing was deafening. It wasn't just the fear keeping me up, though. It was the guilt. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was somehow my fault. If I hadn't sold off most of my herd, if I'd fixed that fence sooner, if I'd been more aware of the impact all this development was having, maybe none of this would have happened. A week later, I'm still struggling to make sense of it all. I've been scouring the internet for similar stories, desperate for some validation that I'm not crazy. There are more accounts out there than you'd think, but nothing quite like what I experienced. I've thought about selling the farm and moving away, but where would I go? How do I know I wouldn't just be walking into another Bigfoot's territory? And honestly, part of me is afraid to leave, afraid that by staying, I might learn more, might finally get some answers. The worst part is the not knowing why this happened, why my farm was targeted, not knowing what became of Max, not knowing if it will ever come back. Every day I walk my property line searching for signs. Every night I lie awake, listening for sounds in the woods. I know this all sounds completely insane. If someone had told me this story a month ago, I'd have laughed in their face. But I'm telling you, with every fiber of my being, this is real. This happened. And if it can happen here, on my quiet little farm, it can happen anywhere. So consider this a warning. If you live near the woods, if there's been a lot of development in your area, be on guard. These creatures are out there, and they're angry. We've pushed them too far, and now they're pushing back. I don't know what I'm going to do next. Part of me wants to mount an expedition into those woods to find proof and vindication, but a bigger part is terrified of what I might find. For now, I'm just trying to get through each day, jumping at shadows and straining to hear footsteps in the night. If anyone out there has had a similar experience, please reach out. I need to know I'm not alone in this. And if you haven't, well, count yourself lucky. But stay vigilant, because trust me, you don't want to go through what I've been through. You don't want to see what I've seen. I'll update if anything else happens, though God knows I hope it doesn't. Stay safe out there, folks, and whatever you do, don't underestimate what's lurking in the woods. I made that mistake, and it cost me dearly. Story 13. I work as a carpenter in Fairbanks, Alaska. It was a typical summer evening, and I was driving home after finishing up a deck job for a client. The sun was still high in the sky. You know how it is up here in the summer, with the endless daylight. I was cruising down Autumn Drive, not far from Pearl Creek Elementary School. The road was empty, and I was lost in thought about what I'd make for dinner when I got home. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a person standing on the side of the road. Nothing unusual about that, right? But as I got closer, something felt off. The figure was tall, maybe around 6 feet, but it had this weird reddish rusty color. I slowed down, trying to get a better look. My heart started racing as I realized this was no person. The thing was covered in fur, thick fur, maybe 3 or 4 inches long, and its body, it was bulky, muscular. I'd guess it weighed around 200 pounds, easy. I must have been only about 50 feet away when it suddenly turned and looked right at me. I'll never forget those eyes. They weren't animal eyes, but they weren't human either. There was an intelligence there that sent chills down my spine. For a split second, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, faster than I thought possible, it bolted. The way it ran was unlike anything I've ever seen. It had this strange, hoppy gait, almost like it was bouncing. But damn, was it fast. In seconds, it had disappeared into the thick woods beside the road. I sat there in my truck, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Had I really just encountered a Bigfoot in Fairbanks? The whole thing lasted maybe 30 seconds, tops, but it felt like an eternity. I kept replaying it in my mind, questioning if I'd really seen what I thought I saw. Maybe it was just someone in a really good costume. But who would be walking around in a furry suit in July in Alaska? I didn't know what to do. Should I call someone? Would anyone even believe me? I decided to drive home, my hands shaking the whole way. I couldn't stop looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that creature following me. When I got home, I paced around my living room for a good hour, debating what to do. Finally, I decided to call Fish and Game. I figured if anyone should know about a strange creature in the area, it would be them. The person who answered the phone sounded bored, like they were just going through the motions. I stumbled through my story, trying to explain what I'd seen without sounding like a complete lunatic. But I could tell from their tone that they didn't believe me. They said they'd make a note of it, but I knew they were just humoring me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature staring at me. I kept hearing noises outside my window, convinced it had followed me home. But morning came, and everything was normal. Over the next few days, I scoured the local news, hoping to see if anyone else had reported a similar sighting. Nothing. I even drove back to that stretch of Autumn Drive, looking for any signs. Broken branches, fur caught on trees, anything. But there was no trace. It's been years now, and I still don't know what to make of what I saw that day. Was it really a Bigfoot? Some unknown species? Or was it just an elaborate prank? I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, and I can't come up with a logical explanation. I know how it sounds. Believe me, if someone had told me this story before it happened, I would have thought they were crazy or lying. But I know what I saw. That creature was real, and it was unlike anything I've ever encountered before or since. I've never been much for the supernatural or conspiracy theories. I'm just a regular guy who works with his hands and minds his own business. But that day, in July 2009, changed everything for me. It made me realize that there are things out there we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of the world. I still drive down Autumn Drive sometimes, always slowing down near that spot. Part of me hopes to see it again, to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But another part of me is terrified of what might happen if I did. I've thought about reaching out to Bigfoot researchers or paranormal investigators, but I always chicken out. What if they don't believe me either? Or worse, what if they do, and my quiet life in Fairbanks becomes a circus of UFO chasers and cryptozoologists? So I've kept this story to myself, until now. I don't know why I'm sharing it here, to be honest. Maybe I'm hoping someone else out there has seen something similar. Maybe I just need to get it off my chest after all these years. All I know is that my encounter that day changed me. I look at the world differently now. I'm more aware of my surroundings, especially when I'm in the woods. And I can't help but wonder what other secrets are hiding out there, just beyond the trees. To this day, every time I hear a strange noise in the forest, or see an unusual shadow out of the corner of my eye, my heart races. For a split second, I'm back on that road, staring into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw. And I know that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of Alaska, there's a creature that defies explanation. A creature that, for just a few seconds, looked into my eyes and changed my world forever. So, if you're ever driving down Autumn Drive in Fairbanks, keep your eyes open. You never know what you might see lurking at the edge of the woods. And if you do see something, well, at least you'll know you're not alone. Story 14. I was stationed at the base as a non-commissioned officer, and my wife and kids had recently joined me there. We were still getting used to the remote Alaskan surroundings, the vast wilderness, the dense forests, the unpredictable wildlife. But nothing could have prepared us for what we saw that night. We decided to take a drive down Trainer Gate Road after dinner. It was a clear evening, the sun still up, even though it was getting late. That's Alaska for you in the spring, endless daylight. The kids were chattering in the back seat, excited to maybe spot some moose or other animals. As we drove along the quiet road, surrounded by thick forest on both sides, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The trees seemed to loom closer, their shadows deeper than usual. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, trying to stay alert. Suddenly, movement caught my eye up ahead. At first, I thought it was just a large bear crossing the road. We'd seen plenty of those around the base. But as we got closer, I realized this was something very different. This creature was massive. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe closer to 8, and it was covered in dark, shaggy hair from head to toe. But the most unnerving thing was how it moved. It wasn't lumbering like a bear at all. It was striding across the road on 2 legs, smoothly and quickly. I hit the brakes, and we all sat there in stunned silence as this thing crossed the entire 35-foot width of the road in just 4 or 5 huge steps. Its gait was bizarrely fluid for something so large, almost graceful, but in a terrifying way. As it reached the tree line on the other side, it turned slightly, and I caught a glimpse of its profile. The head was massive and seemed to sit directly on its shoulders, no real neck to speak of. Its arms hung long at its sides, swinging as it walked. Just before it disappeared into the woods, it seemed to sense us watching. It paused for a split second and turned its head in our direction. I couldn't make out any real facial features in the fading light, but I swear I felt its eyes lock onto mine. A chill ran down my spine, unlike anything I'd ever felt before. And then, in another stride or two, it was gone, vanished into the thick underbrush as if it had never been there at all. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The silence in the car was deafening. Then my youngest started crying, and it snapped us all back to reality. What was that?" my wife whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. I'd been an avid hunter for years. I knew the wildlife in these parts like the back of my hand. But this was something else entirely. "It wasn't a bear," I said firmly, trying to keep my own voice steady. "The way it moved, no bear walks like that." We drove home in a daze, each lost in our own thoughts. The kids were unnaturally quiet in the back seat. I could tell they were scared, but honestly, so was I. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Could it have been some kind of elaborate hoax? A man in a costume? But no, the fluid movement, the sheer size of the thing, it didn't add up. The next morning I decided I had to go back. I needed to see if there was any evidence, anything to prove that what we saw was real. I told my wife I was heading to the base early and drove out to Trainer Gate Road. The morning light made everything seem so normal, so mundane. It was hard to believe that just hours ago we'd witnessed something so inexplicable on this very stretch of road. I parked where I thought we'd stopped the night before and started searching the area. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just the usual forest debris and animal tracks. But then, near the edge of the road, I saw them. Footprints. But not like any animal tracks I'd ever seen before. They were huge, easily 15 inches long and incredibly wide. The strangest part was how they were angled. They pointed inward, almost like a pigeon-toed human stride. I'd never seen anything like it in all my years of hunting and tracking. I followed the tracks to where they disappeared into the underbrush. The vegetation was thick here, but I could see where something large had pushed through, leaving a trail of bent and broken branches. As I stood there, staring into the dense forest, a sense of unease washed over me. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like something was watching me from just beyond my sight. A twig snapped somewhere in the distance, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. That was enough for me. I hurried back to my car, my heart pounding. Over the next few weeks, I discreetly asked around the base if anyone else had seen or heard anything unusual. A few people mentioned strange noises in the woods at night, or feeling like they were being watched when they were out on patrol. But no one else had seen what we saw. I thought about reporting it officially, but what would I say? That my family and I saw Bigfoot crossing the road? I'd be laughed off the base, so I kept it to myself, but it ate at me. I started researching, trying to find any similar sightings in the area. I learned that the land around Fort Wainwright was perfect for something like this to hide. Vast stretches of wilderness, dense vegetation, the Chena River nearby. It was entirely possible for a large creature to live there undetected. But the more I learned, the more questions I had. If this thing was real, how had it managed to stay hidden for so long? How many of them were there? And most importantly, were they dangerous? I found myself growing paranoid. Every time I had to work a night shift or go on a training exercise in the woods, I was on edge. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump. My wife noticed the change in me. She tried to talk about what we'd seen, but I shut her down. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was. But the truth was, I was terrified. Months passed, and slowly, life started to return to normal. The memory of that night began to fade, becoming almost dreamlike. Sometimes I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. But then I'd remember the footprints I found the next morning, the way the creature moved, the feeling of its eyes on me, and I knew it was real. I never saw it again during my time at Fort Wainwright. We left Alaska a couple of years later, and part of me was relieved to go. But even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that night. Sometimes, when I'm out in the woods or driving down a dark, lonely road, I find myself scanning the tree line, waiting, wondering if I'll ever see it again, and hoping that I won't. I don't know what we saw that night in Alaska. I can't explain it, and I'm not sure I want to. But I know this. There are things out there in the wilderness that we can't begin to understand, and sometimes it's better not to try. Story 15. I'll never forget that day in December 2003. It was supposed to be just another fun snowmobiling trip with my buddies near Anchorage, but it turned into something I still can't fully explain. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, excited to hit the fresh powder after the first big snowfall of the season. There were 4 of us, me, Jake, Mike, and Chris. We'd all grown up riding snowmobiles, so we knew these trails like the backs of our hands. The morning started off normal enough. We loaded up our gear, grabbed some coffee and donuts for the road, and headed out to our usual spot near the Anchorage Coastal Wildlife Refuge. The air was crisp and cold, our breath forming little clouds as we unloaded the snowmobiles from the trailer. I remember thinking how perfect the conditions were as we set off down the trail. A thick blanket of untouched snow covered everything, muffling the sounds of the forest. The sky was a brilliant blue, with sunlight glinting off icicles hanging from tree branches. We rode for a couple hours, whooping and hollering as we carved fresh tracks through the powder. I was in the lead, setting the pace as we wound our way through the trees. We were having a blast, just 4 friends enjoying the beautiful Alaskan wilderness. That's when things started to get weird. I noticed some strange tracks in the snow ahead of us. At first I thought maybe it was just shadows playing tricks on my eyes, but as we got closer, I could see they were definitely footprints, big ones. Way too big to be human, and not the right shape for a bear or moose. I slowed down, signaling to the guys behind me. We came to a stop and climbed off our machines to take a closer look. The prints were huge, easily 15 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They were fresh, too, pressed deep into the new snow. "What the hell made those?" Jake asked, crouching down to examine them. "I don't know, man, but they're freaking me out," Mike replied. "Maybe we should head back." I'll admit, I was spooked, too. But curiosity got the better of me. "Let's follow them for a bit," I suggested. "See where they go." The guys reluctantly agreed, and we remounted our snowmobiles. I led the way, following the mysterious tracks as they wound through the trees. They seemed to be heading towards a clearing up ahead. As we approached the edge of the clearing, I suddenly caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head just in time to see something massive step out from behind a large pine tree about 30 feet away. My blood ran cold. Standing there, clear as day, was a creature I can only describe as Bigfoot. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown, matted fur. The face was ape-like, but disturbingly human at the same time. For a split second, we just stared at each other. I was frozen in shock, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. Then the creature turned and started to run. But it wasn't running like a person or an animal. Its movements were smooth and fluid, almost gliding across the deep snow. Its arms were bent at the elbows, swinging in perfect rhythm with its long strides. I watched in awe as it covered ground with incredible speed, despite the challenging terrain. In a matter of seconds, it reached a fallen log buried under the snow. Without breaking stride, the creature leapt clean over it, easily clearing 15 feet in a single bound. Then it disappeared into the thick trees on the other side of the clearing. The whole encounter lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. I sat there on my idling snowmobile, heart pounding, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. A shout from behind snapped me back to reality. "Holy shit! Did you guys see that?" It was Chris, his voice shaky with fear and disbelief. We all started talking at once, our words tumbling out in a rush of adrenaline and shock. "What the fuck was that thing?" "It was huge. Did you see how fast it moved? There's no way that was a bear, right?" We debated for a few minutes, all of us shaken by what we'd seen. Part of me wanted to follow the tracks, to try and catch another glimpse of the creature, but a larger part was screaming to get the hell out of there. In the end, self-preservation won out. We turned our snowmobiles around and hightailed it back to the truck, constantly looking over our shoulders, half expecting to see that thing loping after us through the trees. The ride back was tense and quiet. We were all lost in our own thoughts, trying to rationalize what we'd experienced. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, focusing on the details to make sure I wasn't misremembering or exaggerating. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became. This wasn't a bear or a moose or any other animal I'd ever seen in these woods. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, the sheer size of it, this was something else entirely. When we got back to Anchorage, we went straight to a bar and started downing beers, trying to calm our nerves. We talked it over for hours, comparing what each of us had seen. Jake and Mike had only caught a glimpse as it ran away, but Chris had seen it almost as clearly as I had. He backed up everything I remembered: the height, the fur, the incredible agility. We made a pact that night not to tell anyone else about what happened. Who would believe us anyway? We'd be laughed out of town, labeled as drunk idiots or attention-seeking liars. But I know what I saw. In the years since, I've done a ton of research on Bigfoot sightings and encounters. I've read about the Patterson-Gimlin film, studied supposed Sasquatch footprint casts, and pored over eyewitness accounts from all over North America. And you know what? A lot of those stories line up eerily well with our experience. The size, the movement, the way it disappeared so quickly into the forest, it all fits the pattern. I've been back to those woods many times since then, always keeping an eye out for signs of the creature. I've never seen it again, but sometimes when I'm out there alone on my snowmobile, I get the distinct feeling I'm being watched. I don't know if what we saw that day was truly Bigfoot, or some undiscovered species, or something else entirely. But I know it was real, and it was unlike anything I've ever encountered before or since. That day changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things out there we can't explain, creatures that defy our understanding of the natural world. I'm not saying I believe every crazy conspiracy theory out there, but I'm a lot more open-minded now about what might be possible. Sometimes I wonder if that creature is still out there, roaming the vast Alaskan wilderness. Part of me hopes to see it again someday, to prove to myself and the world that I'm not crazy. But another part hopes I never cross paths with it again, because as amazing as that encounter was, it was also terrifying in a way I can't fully describe. All I know for sure is that on that cold December day in 2003, my friends and I saw something extraordinary. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget the moment I locked eyes with what I can only call Bigfoot. Story 16. We'd spent most of the day hiking, taking in the crisp mountain air and stunning views. As evening approached, we found a nice spot to set up camp near a babbling creek. After getting the tent pitched and a small fire going, we sat back with some beers, sharing stories and laughing as the sun dipped below the tree line. It was well after dark when I decided to take a quick bathroom break before turning in. I grabbed my headlamp and walked a short ways from camp, finding a spot behind some bushes to do my business. As I was finishing up, I heard what sounded like heavy footsteps on the nearby trail. Figuring it was probably Jake, I called out, "Hey man, I'll be right there." But as I turned to head back, my headlamp beam caught something that made my blood run cold. There, not 30 feet away on the trail, was a massive, dark figure. At first glance, I thought it might be someone on a bicycle due to its odd stance, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized with dawning horror that this was no bike rider. The creature was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, standing with its legs spread wide apart and arms curled inward. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur. This was no bear. The proportions were all wrong, far too human-like. Yet it was clearly not human either. My mind reeled as I tried to process what I was seeing. For a moment, we just stared at each other, frozen in place. I could hear my own ragged breathing and pounding heart. Then the thing let out a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. Panic overtook me, and I shouted for Jake at the top of my lungs. In an instant, the creature turned and bolted into the woods with shocking speed and agility for its size. The sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves faded quickly as it vanished into the darkness. I sprinted back to camp, nearly hysterical as I tried to explain to Jake what I'd seen. He grabbed a flashlight and we cautiously went to investigate, but found no sign of the creature. No footprints, no broken foliage, nothing. Jake was skeptical, suggesting I'd seen a bear, or maybe just had too much to drink. But I know what I saw. That thing was no bear, and I was stone-cold sober. We barely slept that night, huddled in the tent with our knives close at hand. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf had us on edge. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Could it have been... No, it couldn't be. But what else could explain what I saw? The next morning, we scoured the area in the daylight, looking for any evidence. But again, we found nothing conclusive. No tracks, no hair, no sign that anything unusual had been there. Jake was convinced I'd imagined it all, or maybe seen a bear in the dark and let my imagination run wild. We cut our trip short and hiked out that day. The whole way back, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow in the trees seemed to hide some hulking form. I kept seeing flashes of movement in my peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing there. It's been months now, and I still struggle to explain what happened that night. I've done endless research, looking into local folklore and trying to find similar encounters in the area. I've even reached out to Bigfoot researchers, though I'm hesitant to use that term. It sounds crazy, I know, but I can't deny what I saw with my own eyes. Jake thinks I'm obsessed, that I need to let it go. But how can I? That creature was real, and it was out there in those woods. What if there are more? What if they're closer to civilization than we realize? The thought keeps me up at night sometimes. I go back and forth between wanting answers and wishing I could forget the whole thing. Part of me wants to return to Kennecott, to search for more evidence, but another part is terrified of what I might find, or what might find me. The frustration of not being believed eats at me. I know what I saw wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a suit, wasn't my imagination. It was something other, something that shouldn't exist, but does. I feel like I've had a glimpse behind the curtain of reality, and now I can't unsee it. I'm sharing this story not for attention or to convince anyone, but in hopes that maybe someone out there has had a similar experience, that maybe I'm not crazy, and there really are things in this world beyond our understanding. If you've seen something like this, please reach out. I need to know I'm not alone in this. For now, I avoid camping and stick to day hikes in well-populated areas. The wilderness has lost its allure for me. Every time I'm in the woods, I find myself scanning the trees, jumping at shadows. That night changed me in ways I'm still trying to process. I don't know if I'll ever have answers about what I encountered in Kennecott, but I know with absolute certainty that something was out there. Something large, powerful, and very much not human. And the thought that it's still out there, possibly watching and waiting, haunts me to this day. So, if you're planning a trip to Kennecott, or really anywhere in the backcountry, stay alert. Be aware of your surroundings. And if you hear heavy footsteps on the trail at night, well, maybe it's best not to look. Story 17. I'll never forget that day in the Alaskan wilderness. September 3rd, 1998. My buddy Jack and I were out on our annual caribou hunting trip, deep in the remote backcountry. We'd been coming to this same spot for years, knew the terrain like the back of our hands, but nothing could have prepared us for what we saw that day. We'd set up our small camp near a ridge overlooking a clearing where we often spotted caribou grazing. It was early morning, and we were settling in with our binoculars, scanning the area. The air was crisp, carrying that distinct scent of spruce and damp earth. Everything seemed normal at first, just the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Then I noticed something moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing. At first I thought it was a bear, but as I focused my binoculars, I realized this was something entirely different. My heart started racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. "Jack," I whispered urgently, "take a look over there, about 2 o'clock. Tell me what you see." Jack raised his binoculars, and I heard his sharp intake of breath. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. The creature was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. It was covered in long, shaggy grey fur, but the most unsettling thing was how it moved. It walked upright on 2 legs, with a smooth gait unlike any animal I'd ever encountered. Its arms swung at its sides as it took long, purposeful strides. We watched in stunned silence as it emerged from the tree line into the open area of the clearing. Its movements were swift and surprisingly graceful for something so large. It covered ground quickly, moving with what seemed like intelligence and intent. I felt a chill run down my spine. In all my years hunting in Alaska, I'd never seen anything remotely like this. Bears, moose, wolves, I knew how they all moved. This was something else entirely. "Should we try to get closer?" Jack whispered. I shook my head vehemently. Some primal instinct told me that would be a very bad idea. We stayed frozen in place, watching through our binoculars as the creature made its way across the clearing. For over an hour, we observed its movements. It seemed to be foraging, stopping occasionally to inspect the ground or reach up into the lower branches of trees. A few times it paused and appeared to scan its surroundings, and I could have sworn it looked right in our direction. I held my breath, heart pounding, willing us to be invisible. As the creature moved back towards the tree line on the far side of the clearing, we finally dared to speak again in hushed tones. "What do you think that was?" Jack asked, his voice shaky. I shook my head. "I have no idea, but I know it wasn't a bear or any other animal I've ever seen up here." We debated whether to break camp and hike out early. Part of me wanted to get the hell out of there as fast as possible, but we'd been planning this trip for months, and we had a bush plane scheduled to pick us up in 3 days. In the end, we decided to stay, but we were on high alert for the rest of the trip. We didn't see the creature again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made me jump. I barely slept, lying awake straining my ears for any unusual sounds in the darkness. When our bush pilot finally arrived to pick us up, we were beyond relieved. As we loaded our gear into the plane, I hesitated, then decided to mention what we'd seen to the pilot. He was a grizzled old-timer who'd been flying these remote areas for decades. "Hey, Bill," I said casually, trying to keep my voice steady. "We saw something weird out there. Some kind of huge animal walking on 2 legs. Gray fur. Have you ever heard of anything like that around here?" Bill's weathered face grew serious. He glanced around, then leaned in close. "You boys saw the hairy man," he said in a low voice. "The natives round here have stories going back generations. Call it different names depending on the tribe, but they all talk about a giant creature that walks like a man." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You're joking, right?" I said weakly. Bill shook his head. "I've been flying these parts for 40 years, heard a lot of stories, seen some strange things myself. Whatever's out there, it ain't no bear." The flight back to civilization was tense and quiet. Jack and I exchanged uneasy glances, both lost in our own thoughts. It's been years now, but I still think about that day constantly. I've done research, read about similar sightings. Some people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. The local tribes have their own names for it. I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is what I saw that day was real. It wasn't a bear or any other known animal. The way it moved, the intelligence in its actions, it was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist, but does. I've never gone back to that specific spot, haven't been caribou hunting since. The encounter changed something in me, made me realize there are things in this world we don't understand, things that defy explanation. Sometimes late at night, when the wind is howling outside, I find myself thinking about that creature, wondering if it's still out there, moving silently through the vast Alaskan wilderness. And I shudder, knowing that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 18. I'll never forget that day near Skilak Lake. It was late October, just before the first snow, and I was out checking my trap lines like I do every year. The air was crisp and still, with that sharp pine smell you only get in the Alaskan wilderness. I'd been walking for hours through the dense spruce forest, my boots crunching on the carpet of fallen needles. As I made my way down an old logging road, something caught my eye about 300 yards ahead. At first I thought it was a bear. We get plenty of those around Sterling. But as I squinted to get a better look, I realized this was something different. It was walking upright on two legs, but it wasn't a person. This thing was massive, easily 7 feet tall and covered in dark, shaggy hair from head to toe. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was looking at. All those stories I'd heard growing up. Could it really be? I froze in my tracks, not daring to move a muscle. The creature was just casually strolling across the road, like it was out for a Sunday walk. Then suddenly it stopped and turned its head in my direction. Even from that distance, I could feel its eyes lock onto me. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I slowly reached for the shotgun slung over my shoulder, my hands shaking. But before I could raise it, the thing bolted into the trees and vanished. I stood there for what felt like hours, straining my ears for any sound of movement in the forest. But there was nothing, just the usual chirping of birds and rustling of leaves. Eventually, I worked up the courage to continue down the road, my shotgun at the ready. When I reached the spot where I'd seen it cross, I searched for tracks or hair or any sign it had been there. The ground was hard-packed dirt and gravel, though, and I couldn't make out any clear prints. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at me. But the woods were silent and still. I debated reporting what I'd seen, but who would believe me? I've lived in Alaska my whole life, and I know how outsiders view us. They already think we're all a bunch of crazy backwoods folk. If I went to the authorities claiming I saw Bigfoot, I'd be laughed out of town. So I kept it to myself. But I haven't been able to shake the memory of that day. Every time I'm out in those woods now, I'm on high alert. Was it really Bigfoot? Or just my eyes playing tricks on me? I don't know. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't anything I can explain. I've heard all the skeptics' arguments that it was just a bear standing up or someone in a costume playing a prank. But this was different. The way it moved was too fluid, too natural, and the intelligence in its eyes, there was something almost human there. Since that day, I've done a lot of research into Bigfoot sightings in Alaska. Turns out there's been quite a few reports over the years, especially in the more remote areas. Some dismiss it as folklore, but talking to other witnesses, I'm convinced there's something out there we can't explain. I've gone back to that spot near Skilak Lake many times since, hoping to catch another glimpse, but I've never seen anything like it again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember the fear I felt in that moment, the primal gut-wrenching terror of encountering something unknown. That wasn't imagination. I still go out to check my trap lines every year, but I'm a lot more cautious now. I'm always scanning the trees, listening for any unusual sounds, and I never go out there without my gun, loaded and ready, just in case. Some nights I lie awake, replaying that encounter in my mind. What if I had tried to get closer? What if I had fired a warning shot? Would it have run, or would it have charged at me? The questions haunt me. I've thought about setting up trail cameras in that area, trying to capture proof, but part of me doesn't want to know. What if I did get evidence? Would I be able to keep it secret, or would I feel compelled to share it with the world? And what would that mean for these creatures, if they really do exist? There's a part of the Alaskan wilderness that's still wild, still unexplored. Most people don't realize just how vast and empty this land is. There are valleys and forests where humans might not set foot for decades. Who knows what could be living out there, hidden away from civilization? I know how crazy this all sounds. If someone had told me this story a few years ago, I probably would have thought they were nuts or on drugs. But experiencing it firsthand, it changes you, makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. I've always considered myself a pretty rational person. I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or aliens or any of that nonsense. But this was real. I saw it with my own two eyes. And no matter how much I try to explain it away, I can't shake the feeling that there's something out there. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. Sometimes when I'm out in the woods now, I'll catch a whiff of a musky animal smell that isn't quite right. Or I'll hear a strange whooping call echoing through the trees, and for a split second, my heart races and I think, is it back? I've thought about reaching out to some of those Bigfoot research groups, sharing my story. But I'm worried about bringing a bunch of amateur monster hunters to our quiet corner of Alaska. This is my home, and I don't want it overrun by thrill seekers and conspiracy theorists. So I've kept it to myself all this time. Sometimes I think about telling my hunting buddies, but I know they'd just laugh it off. And my family, well, I don't want them to think I'm losing my mind. So I carry this secret, this burden of knowledge that there's something out there in the woods that defies explanation. I still go about my life, still hunt and fish and enjoy the Alaskan wilderness. But I'm always watching, always listening. Every snapped twig makes me jump. Every shadow in the trees could be hiding something. I don't know if I'll ever see it again. Part of me hopes I do, just to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But another part of me dreads the thought of another encounter. What if next time it doesn't run away? What if next time I'm not so lucky? All I know is that the forests of Alaska hold secrets, ancient primal secrets that we've forgotten or chosen to ignore. And sometimes, if you're in the right place at the right time, those secrets reveal themselves, whether we're ready for them or not. So if you're ever up near Skilak Lake, keep your eyes open and your wits about you. You never know what you might see in those woods. And if you do see something, well, you might want to keep it to yourself. Some truths are better left unspoken. Story 19. It was getting dark as we wound our way along Denali Park Road in Tom's old 1980 Dodge D50 pickup. The truck had seen better days, but it was reliable enough for our outdoor adventures. We were both pretty tired from our trip, so we weren't talking much, just listening to some classic rock on the crackling radio and watching the stunning Alaskan wilderness roll by outside the windows. As we rounded a bend in the road, I suddenly saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There, sitting right in the middle of the road about 50 yards ahead, was some kind of creature. At first glance, I thought maybe it was a bear, but as we got closer, I realized it was something I'd never seen before. "Tom, do you see that?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell?" Tom muttered, slowing the truck down. As we approached, I could make out more details. The thing was sitting with its legs pulled up to its chest and its arms folded over its knees. But what really struck me was its hair, long, reddish-brown hair that covered most of its body. For a split second, my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing, and I actually thought, is that an orangutan? But I knew that was impossible. There are no wild orangutans in Alaska. Tom had slowed to a crawl now, and we were getting unnervingly close to this, whatever it was. Close enough that I could have reached out and touched it if I'd wanted to, which I absolutely did not want to do. The creature didn't move or acknowledge our presence at all. It just sat there, motionless, as our headlights illuminated its shaggy form. I felt frozen in my seat, barely breathing. A chill ran down my spine as we inched past it. I kept expecting it to suddenly move or lunge at the truck, but it remained perfectly still. As we passed by, I caught a glimpse of its face partially hidden behind its folded arms. I only saw it for a split second, but the image is burned into my memory. Dark eyes, a broad nose, almost human-like features, but not quite right. Neither Tom nor I said a word as we drove by. We just stared straight ahead, gripping the dashboard. It wasn't until we were about 100 yards past it that Tom finally broke the silence. What the fuck was that? He said each word slowly, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I turned to look out the back window, half expecting to see the creature chasing after us, but the road behind us was empty. I don't know, I stammered. Did you see its face? It looked almost human. Tom just shook his head, pressing harder on the gas pedal. That wasn't human, and it sure as hell wasn't a bear or any other animal I've ever seen. We drove in tense silence for the next 20 minutes or so, until we reached the small town of Healy. Tom pulled into the first gas station we saw, even though we didn't really need gas. I think we both just wanted to be around other people and lights after what we'd seen. As we sat there in the parking lot, the fluorescent lights of the gas station buzzing overhead, we finally started to process what had happened. Okay, let's think about this logically, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. What are the possibilities here? Could it have been someone in a costume? Tom shook his head. No way. We were close enough to touch that thing. No costume is that realistic. And who the hell would be sitting in a costume in the middle of Denali Park Road at night? He had a point. Plus, the way it had just sat there, completely still and unresponsive as we drove by, it didn't seem like human behavior at all. What about some kind of escaped zoo animal? I suggested, grasping at straws. Maybe a really hairy primate of some kind? In Alaska? Come on, man, you know there's nothing like that around here, Tom replied. Besides, did you see its face? That wasn't any kind of ape I've ever seen. We fell silent again, both lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of those dark eyes peering out from behind hairy arms. There was an intelligence there, a presence that felt ancient somehow. You don't think... I hesitated, almost not wanting to say it out loud. You don't think it could have been a Bigfoot, do you? Tom let out a humorless laugh. A Bigfoot? Really? Come on. You know I don't believe in that stuff. I know, I said. But what else could it have been? We both saw it. It was right there in front of us. Tom didn't respond for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. I don't know what it was, but I know what I saw, and it wasn't anything normal. We sat there for a while longer, neither of us really wanting to get back on the road. Eventually, we decided to grab some coffee and snacks from the gas station before continuing on to Fairbanks. As we walked into the store, I half expected to see a news report about some strange creature sighted in Denali. But everything seemed normal, just a few sleepy travelers and the bored-looking cashier. The rest of the drive home was uneventful, but tense. We kept scanning the sides of the road, jumping at every shadow. When we finally made it back to Fairbanks, I don't think I'd ever been so relieved to see the city lights. In the days and weeks that followed, Tom and I talked about that night a lot. We debated whether we should report what we'd seen to someone, the park rangers maybe, or even the local news, but we knew how crazy it would sound. Who would believe us? We scoured the internet for any reports of similar sightings in the area, but came up empty. It seemed like our encounter was a one-off event, or at least the only one that had been witnessed and talked about. It's been years now since that night on Denali Park Road. Tom and I don't talk about it much anymore, but I know neither of us has forgotten. Sometimes when I'm driving on a dark, lonely road, I'll catch myself scanning the shadows, half expecting to see that hulking, hairy figure sitting there waiting for me. I don't know what we saw that night. I'm not saying it was definitely Bigfoot or some other cryptid, but I know it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in this world, And I know that the memory of those eyes staring out at me from the darkness will stay with me for the rest of my life. So if you're ever driving through Denali National Park late at night, keep your eyes on the road, but also keep them on the shadows at the edge of your headlights, because you never know what might be waiting there, watching and waiting for you to pass by. Story 20. Mom was working the late shift at the diner in town, so I was home alone. I was in my bedroom, just messing around online and chatting with friends. It was around 11 p.m. when I first heard it. Heavy footsteps crunching in the snow outside my window. At first I didn't think much of it. Probably just a deer or something. We got a lot of wildlife wandering through our yard. But then the footsteps started pacing back and forth, back and forth. That wasn't normal animal behavior. I muted my computer and listened closely. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, and they sounded big, way too big to be a deer. My heart started racing as I realized whatever was out there was walking on two legs. I was scared to look, but I had to know what it was. I crept over to my window and slowly pulled back the curtain just enough to peek out. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a massive black figure standing in our yard, right outside my window. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. The moonlight silhouetted its huge, hulking shape. It was covered in what looked like thick, shaggy fur. As I watched in terror, it turned and looked directly at me with glowing eyes. I gasped and stumbled backwards, letting the curtain fall back into place. My whole body was shaking. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream or something. But then those heavy footsteps started up again, closer this time. Thump, thump, thump. The whole house seemed to vibrate with each step. Whatever that thing was, it was coming towards my window. I was frozen in place, too terrified to move. The footsteps got louder and louder until they were right outside. Then they stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound. Suddenly there was a deep, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It sounded almost human, but not quite. That snapped me out of my paralysis. I bolted out of my room and ran to my mom's bedroom, diving into her closet and shutting the door. I curled up in a ball, shaking uncontrollably. I don't know how long I stayed in there. It felt like hours. I kept hearing those heavy footsteps pacing around outside, circling the house. Occasionally, there would be another one of those bone-chilling growls. At some point, I must have passed out from sheer terror and exhaustion. The next thing I remember is my mom shaking me awake. She had gotten home from her shift and found me huddled in her closet. I was hysterical, babbling about the monster outside. Mom tried to calm me down, telling me it was just a nightmare. But I knew what I had seen and heard was real. We went outside to look around, but there was no sign of the creature. Just some strange, huge footprints in the snow that had already started to melt. Mom said they were probably just from a bear, but I knew better. No bear walks on 2 legs like that. For weeks afterwards, I was too scared to sleep in my own room. I kept having vivid nightmares about glowing eyes staring at me through my window. Even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about that night. I've done a lot of research since then, trying to figure out what I saw. The closest thing I can find is stories about Bigfoot sightings. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear that's what it was. What else could explain what I experienced? The weirdest part is, nothing like that ever happened again. It was just that one night, and then whatever it was disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the pure terror I felt, and I know it was real. I've never told many people about this. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw and heard that night. There was something out there, something big and not of this world. And for some reason, it came to my window and then vanished without a trace. I still live in that same small town. Every now and then I'll hear stories from other locals about strange sightings in the woods or weird howls at night. It makes me wonder if that creature is still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. Sometimes on quiet nights, I find myself straining to listen for those heavy footsteps again. Part of me hopes I'll never hear them. But another part of me is desperate for proof that I'm not crazy, that what I experienced was real. All I know for sure is that something inexplicable and terrifying happened to me that night. And I'll never forget the paralyzing fear I felt as I cowered in that closet, listening to an impossible creature growl outside my window. It's been almost 20 years, but I can still picture every detail so vividly. The massive black shape, the glowing eyes, the house-shaking footsteps. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I hear those growls again. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was just some elaborate prank, or a bear walking funny, or my teenage imagination running wild. But deep down, I know none of those explanations fit. What I encountered that night was something beyond normal explanation. Since then, I've become obsessed with researching cryptids and unexplained phenomena. I've read countless books and articles, scoured message boards, even gone on a few Bigfoot hunting expeditions. But nothing has ever come close to what I experienced firsthand. Sometimes I wonder why it chose my house that night. Why me? Was it just random chance, or was there some greater purpose? I'll probably never know. But the encounter changed me forever. I can never look at the world the same way again, knowing what's really out there lurking in the shadows. I still live in fear that someday those footsteps will return, that I'll look out my window and see those glowing eyes staring back at me again. It's a fear I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. So that's my story. I know it sounds insane. Hell, sometimes I still have trouble believing it myself. But I swear on everything I hold dear that it's the truth. Something impossible and terrifying visited me that night, and I'll never be the same. Story 21. It was a Friday evening in late October. I was driving my 3 kids home from my parents' house where we'd had dinner. The sun had set about an hour earlier, and a thick blanket of darkness had settled over the rural roads. My oldest, Jake, was 12 at the time. Emma was 9, and little Zoe had just turned 6. We were taking our usual route home, a winding back road that cuts through dense forest for about 20 miles before reaching our town. I've driven it hundreds of times over the years and know every curve like the back of my hand. But that night, something felt off. I can't explain it, but there was a heaviness in the air, an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. About halfway through our drive, we passed the old scrapyard. It's been abandoned for years, just a sprawling lot filled with rusted-out cars and twisted metal. The kids always begged me to stop and explore during the day, but I never let them. Something about that place gives me the creeps. As we drove by, I noticed movement in the thick bushes lining the road near the yard's entrance. At first, I thought it was just shadows from our headlights playing tricks on me, but then I saw a flash of something. 2 piercing blue eyes reflecting the light. But they were so high up, way above where a deer or coyote's eyes would be. I slowed the car instinctively, squinting to try and make out what I was seeing. That's when I realized the sheer size of whatever was standing there. It had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall. My breath caught in my throat as my mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was looking at. "Mom, what's that?" Emma's voice broke the silence, making me jump. She was peering out her window, eyes wide. I'm not sure, sweetie," I stammered, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. Probably just a bear or something. But I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't have bright blue eyes, and they certainly don't stand that tall. As we inched closer, I could make out more details. The creature was massive, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung nearly to its knees. It was covered in dark, shaggy fur that seemed to blend into the shadows. But its face... God, its face. It was almost human-like, with a pronounced brow and a wide, flat nose. Those eyes, though, they seemed to glow with an otherworldly intelligence as they stared directly at us. I wanted to floor it, to speed away as fast as possible, but I was paralyzed with fear, my foot barely touching the gas pedal as we crept forward. "Mommy, I see its feet!" Zoe squealed from the back seat. "They're huge!" That snapped me out of my trance. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw my youngest daughter kneeling on her seat, face pressed against the window. The thought of her being that close to whatever that thing was sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. "Sit down and buckle up," I shouted, probably more harshly than I intended. In one fluid motion, I stomped on the gas and yanked the wheel, sending us careening around the creature. As we sped past, I caught one last glimpse in my side mirror. The thing had turned to watch us go, its massive form silhouetted against the moonlit sky. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw it raise one enormous hand, as if waving goodbye. The kids were all talking at once, a mix of excitement and fear in their voices. Jake was insisting it was just a really tall guy in a costume. Emma thought it might be an escaped zoo animal, and little Zoe was convinced we'd seen Bigfoot. I didn't say a word. I just drove, my heart pounding in my chest, until we finally reached the safety of our well-lit neighborhood. As I pulled into our driveway, I realized I was shaking. That night, after I'd tucked the kids in bed, with promises of extra nightlights, I sat at the kitchen table with a much-needed glass of wine. I tried to process what I'd seen, to find some logical explanation, but every time I closed my eyes, all I could see were those piercing blue eyes staring back at me. I spent hours researching online, looking for any reports of similar sightings in our area. There were a few vague stories about strange noises in the woods or oversized footprints found near hiking trails, but nothing concrete, nothing that matched the sheer terror of what we'd encountered. In the days that followed, I debated whether to report what we'd seen. But to who? The police, fish and wildlife. I could already imagine the skeptical looks, the patronizing smiles as they explained away our experience. So I kept quiet, only confiding in my husband, who listened with a mix of concern and disbelief. It's been 3 months now, and I still haven't driven down that road after dark. I take the long way around, adding an extra 30 minutes to our trip whenever we visit my parents. The kids have mostly forgotten about it, chalking it up to an exciting adventure. But I can't shake it. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can hear something moving outside our house. Heavy footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves, branches snapping under an immense weight. And once, just once, I thought I saw a pair of blue eyes peering in through our second-story window. I tell myself it's just my imagination running wild, that the stress of that night has made me paranoid. But deep down, I know what I saw was real, and I can't help but wonder, what if it followed us home? I don't know if I'll ever have answers. Maybe it's better that way. All I know is that I'll never look at the woods the same way again. And every time I hear a strange noise outside at night, my heart races, and I find myself scanning the tree line, searching for those haunting blue eyes. Story 22. I'll never forget that day near the Alaska-Canada border. My daughter and I had been planning this road trip for months, a chance to bond and explore the rugged wilderness before she left for college. We were driving along a remote stretch of highway, surrounded by towering evergreens and snow-capped mountains in the distance. The scenery was breathtaking, but I couldn't shake an eerie feeling that had been growing stronger as we ventured deeper into the wilderness. It was late afternoon when we decided to pull over at a scenic lookout to stretch our legs and take some photos. As we got out of the car, the crisp mountain air hit us, so clean and fresh compared to the city. My daughter wandered off a bit to get some shots of the landscape while I rummaged in the trunk for our snacks. That's when I heard her gasp. "Dad, look over there," she whispered urgently, pointing towards a stand of white bark trees about 50 yards away. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just the pale trunks gleaming in the fading sunlight. But then I saw it, movement that didn't fit. Something massive reaching up into the branches. My blood ran cold as my eyes focused on the figure. It was enormous, at least 9 feet tall, with a reach that had to be over 12 feet as it effortlessly grasped at the upper branches. The creature's fur was a light reddish-blonde color that almost seemed to shimmer. But what struck me most was how human-like it appeared, despite the impossible size. The proportions were all wrong. Shoulders far too broad and muscular, arms incongruously long. Yet there was an unmistakable intelligence in its movements. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking as I tried to unlock it to take a photo. "Don't move," I breathed to my daughter. "Just stay very still." She nodded, eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. As if sensing our attention, the creature suddenly went very still. Slowly, so slowly, its head began to turn in our direction. I felt rooted to the spot, heart pounding. A primal part of my brain was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't look away. Just as I managed to raise my phone, the being dropped down from the tree with surprising grace for its size. In 2 fluid strides it was behind the trunk, obscured from view. I blinked, certain it would reappear on the other side, but there was nothing. "Where did it go?" my daughter whispered. I shook my head, dumbfounded. There was no way something that large could have simply vanished. We stood frozen for several long moments, straining to catch any sign of movement or sound. But the forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy stillness. Finally, I found my voice. Let's go check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. My daughter nodded, and we cautiously made our way towards the stand of trees. With each step, I expected the creature to suddenly reappear, but we reached the spot without incident. There were clear signs that something had been there. Broken branches high up in the tree, far higher than any normal animal could reach, and on the ground, a massive footprint pressed into the soft earth. My daughter crouched down next to it, placing her hand next to it for scale. The print was easily twice the size of her hand. "Dad, what was that thing?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I shook my head, at a loss for words. I've been an avid outdoorsman all my life, but I'd never seen anything like this. The rational part of my mind tried to come up with explanations. A bear standing on its hind legs, some kind of elaborate hoax. But deep down, I knew we'd witnessed something that defied conventional explanation. We spent another hour combing the area, looking for any other signs or clues. But aside from that single footprint and the broken branches, there was nothing. It was as if the creature had simply melted back into the wilderness. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, we reluctantly headed back to our car. The drive to the next town was tense and quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. We ended up staying in a small motel that night, neither of us keen on camping as we'd originally planned. Over dinner at the only diner in town, we tried to process what we'd seen. My daughter, always the more practical one, suggested we report it to the local authorities or maybe a wildlife agency. But I hesitated. Who would believe us? We had no real evidence beyond that single footprint, which could be explained away as belonging to a large bear. In the end, we decided to keep the encounter to ourselves. But it changed something in both of us. The rest of our trip was colored by what we'd seen. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow at dusk made us tense up, wondering if we'd catch another glimpse of the creature. We never did see it again, but the memory of that day has stayed with me. Sometimes I find myself doubting what I saw, wondering if the isolation and grandeur of the wilderness had somehow played tricks on my mind. But then I remember the look in my daughter's eyes, the undeniable physical evidence we found, and I know it was real. I've spent countless hours since then researching, trying to find any similar accounts or explanations. I've come across stories of Bigfoot and Sasquatch, of course, but most of those describe dark-furred creatures. What we saw was distinctly blonde or reddish, and the way it moved, there was an almost graceful, deliberate quality to its actions that I can't quite shake. I often find myself regretting that we didn't investigate further, that we let our fear hold us back. What if we'd managed to capture clear footage? What if we'd followed its trail? But then I remember the primal fear I felt in that moment, the sense that we were in the presence of something beyond our understanding, and I wonder if we made the right choice after all. To this day, I can't look at a forest the same way. Every time I'm in the wilderness, a part of me is always watching, always listening, wondering if I'll ever catch another glimpse of that impossible creature. It's changed how I view the world and the mysteries it still holds. There are things out there we can't explain, things that challenge everything we think we know. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw that day on the border between Alaska and Canada. And I'll never forget the mixture of awe and terror I felt in that moment, face to face with something that shouldn't exist, yet undeniably did. Sometimes in my dreams, I'm back in that moment. But instead of staying frozen, I find the courage to step forward, to try and communicate with the being. I wake from these dreams with a sense of longing and missed opportunity. What might we have learned if we'd overcome our fear? I've never shared this story publicly before. I'm not sure why I'm doing it now. Maybe it's the need to finally put it into words, to try and make sense of an experience that defies explanation. Or maybe it's the hope that someone out there has seen something similar, that I'm not alone in carrying this impossible memory. All I know is that day changed me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there's so much more to this world than we understand. And while part of me hopes to never encounter such a being again, another part can't help but long for one more glimpse, one more chance to unravel the mystery. Because now I know that the line between the known and the unknown is far blurrier than I ever imagined, and that there are wonders and terrors lurking just beyond the edge of our perception. Story 23. I was just a young recruit back in the summer of '78, fresh out of basic and eager to prove myself. Our unit had been sent up into the mountains for some advanced wilderness training, the kind of stuff that's supposed to separate the men from the boys. Little did I know that those 2 weeks would change my life forever. We'd been hiking for days, pushing ourselves to the limit as we climbed higher and higher into rugged, unforgiving terrain. By the time we made camp that fateful evening, we were well above the tree line, surrounded by nothing but rocky slopes and patches of stubborn summer snow. The air was thin and crisp, carrying that distinctive alpine chill even in July. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley below, I couldn't shake this eerie feeling creeping up my spine. Something about the quiet up there, the sheer isolation, it just didn't sit right. A few of the other guys must have felt it too, because conversation around the campfire was more subdued than usual. We turned in early that night, exhausted from the day's climb. I was sharing a tent with 3 other recruits, Jones, Martinez, and Campbell. I'd barely managed to drift off when a sound jolted me awake. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe someone getting up to take a leak. But then I heard it again, a low, guttural vocalization unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I sat up, straining my ears. The noise came again, closer this time. It was almost like a cross between a deep moan and a howl, but not quite animal, and definitely not human. My heart started racing. I could hear the others stirring too, and Campbell whispered, "What the hell is that?" Before anyone could answer, there was a commotion outside. Boots crunching on gravel, hushed voices. I fumbled for my flashlight and unzipped the tent, poking my head out. Our squad leader, Sergeant Miller, was standing a few yards away with two other guys, all of them staring intently down into the valley. "What's going on, Sarge?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He waved me over urgently. "Get out here, Private. All of you. You need to see this." We scrambled out of our tents, huddling together against the cold. Miller pointed down towards a snow-covered slope about half a mile away. "There," he said. "Watch." At first, I didn't see anything, but then movement caught my eye. A dark figure was crossing the snowfield, moving with an odd, loping gait. Even from this distance, I could tell it was big, way too big to be human. My first thought was that it must be a bear, but as I watched, I realized its movements were all wrong. This thing was walking upright, taking long, swinging strides across the snow. Its arms, if you could call them that, hung down almost to its knees, swaying with each step. The proportions were just off, too tall and lanky for a bear, but far too massive for any man. "Jesus Christ," someone muttered beside me. "What is that thing?" Nobody had an answer. We all just stood there, transfixed, as this creature made its way across the snowfield with unsettling speed and grace. It should have been lumbering and awkward on that terrain, but it moved like it knew every rock and crevice. Suddenly, it stopped. Even from this distance, I swear I could feel its gaze on us. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air. For a long, terrible moment, it just stood there, perfectly still. Then, without warning, it let out a bone-chilling roar that echoed off the mountains. Panic rippled through our group. A couple guys stumbled backwards, nearly falling. I heard the click of a rifle being readied, and Miller barked out, "Stand down! Nobody fires unless I give the order." The creature's head snapped towards us at the sound. Even though I couldn't make out its features clearly, I felt the weight of its stare. My legs turned to jelly, every instinct screaming at me to run. But there was nowhere to go up here. We were exposed, vulnerable. Just when I thought my heart might explode from fear, the thing turned and loped off with shocking speed, disappearing into a rocky ravine. The silence that followed was deafening. For a long time, nobody moved or spoke. We all just stood there, staring at the spot where it had vanished, half expecting it to reappear at any moment. Finally, Miller cleared his throat. "All right, men, back to your tents. We'll discuss this in the morning." But there was no way in hell any of us were going back to sleep. We huddled in our tents, speaking in hushed whispers, jumping at every little sound. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind, trying to make sense of it. It was too big to be human, too nimble to be a bear. The way it moved, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. As the night wore on, the sounds started again, distant at first, but gradually getting closer. Strange vocalizations, rocks clattering down slopes, the crunch of footsteps in snow. We were all armed, of course, but our weapons felt laughably inadequate against whatever was out there. I don't think any of us slept a wink that night. We just lay there, rigid with fear, listening to those sounds circling our camp. At one point, I could have sworn I saw a massive silhouette pass by our tent, blocking out the moonlight for a moment. But I was too terrified to look, to confirm what I already knew in my gut. When dawn finally broke, we emerged from our tents, hollow-eyed and shaken. The crisp mountain air felt oppressive now, and every shadow seemed to hide some lurking threat. Miller gathered us all together, his face grim. "I know what we all saw last night," he said, "and I know what you're thinking, but we have a mission to complete, and that's what we're going to do. We move out in 30 minutes. Stay alert, stay together, and for God's sake, keep your mouths shut about this when we get back to base. Understood?" We all nodded, but I could see the fear in everyone's eyes. As we packed up camp, I noticed deep impressions in the snow nearby, tracks that were unmistakably bipedal but far too large to be human. Nobody said a word about them. The rest of that training exercise is a blur in my memory. We went through the motions, but our hearts weren't in it. Every snapping twig, every shadow sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept expecting to see that creature again, to hear that terrible roar echoing off the mountains. But we never did. Whatever it was seemed to have vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. When we finally made it back to base, true to Miller's orders, none of us breathed a word about what we'd seen. Who would have believed us anyway? It's been over 40 years now, but I still wake up in cold sweats sometimes, that creature's roar ringing in my ears. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, seen grainy photos and shaky videos, but nothing comes close to what we encountered up on that mountain. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was some undiscovered species or something else. But I know what I saw, and I know that there are things out there in the wilderness, in those remote places where humans rarely tread, that defy explanation. Things that remind us that for all our technology and progress, we're not as removed from the primal world as we'd like to believe. I've never gone back to those mountains, never even been camping since then. Some things once seen can't be unseen, and some fears once felt never really leave you. All I know is that those 2 weeks changed me forever and left me with questions I'll never have answers to. But maybe that's for the best, because I'm not sure I really want to know what's out there, watching us from the shadows. Done story 24. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural or cryptids, but something happened to me in 1964 that I just can't explain, no matter how hard I try. It's haunted me for years, and I still get chills thinking about it. I was 28 at the time, living in Fairbanks, Alaska. I'd moved there a few years earlier for work in the oil industry. The wilderness up there is like nothing else, vast, untamed, and full of mystery. I loved to go hunting on my days off, exploring the backcountry and testing my skills against nature. One crisp fall day in early October, I decided to take a solo hunting trip about 30 miles outside of town. The leaves were changing colors, painting the landscape in brilliant reds and golds. There was a chill in the air that hinted at the long winter to come. I packed up my truck with supplies and my trusty rifle, excited for a day away from civilization. I drove out on an old logging road, bouncing along in my pickup as the town faded away behind me. After about an hour, I pulled off onto a narrow dirt track that wound its way deeper into the forest. The trees pressed in close on either side, branches scraping against the sides of my truck. I drove slowly, keeping an eye out for any sign of game. About 5 miles down this overgrown trail, I came to a small clearing and decided it was a good place to park and continue on foot. I grabbed my rifle and pack, taking a moment to breathe in the crisp autumn air. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. I felt a deep sense of peace, alone in the Alaskan wilderness. I set off down an old game trail, moving as quietly as I could through the underbrush. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves that crunched softly under my boots. I kept my senses alert, scanning for any movement or sound that might indicate deer or other wildlife nearby. After hiking for maybe 45 minutes, I came to another small clearing bisected by a narrow dirt road, more of a trail really, probably used by loggers years ago. I paused at the edge of the trees, surveying the open space before me. That's when it happened. In the blink of an eye, a huge figure simply appeared in the middle of the road about 30 feet in front of me. I froze, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark brown fur or hair, distinctly bipedal, but definitely not human. For a moment that felt like an eternity. We just stared at each other. I could see its eyes gleaming with unmistakable intelligence. Steam rose from its body in the cool air. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Then it let out a low, rumbling grunt that seemed to vibrate through my whole body. Without any apparent hurry, it turned and walked into the forest on the other side of the road. Its gait was smooth and silent, nothing like the clumsy shambling you see in movies or reenactments. In seconds, it had vanished into the thick underbrush. I stood there frozen for several minutes, my mind reeling. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the whole thing, but I knew deep down that it had been real. I became aware that my hands were shaking. Despite having my rifle, I had never even thought about raising it. The encounter hadn't felt threatening, more like two creatures briefly sharing the same space before going their separate ways. As my wits slowly returned, I noticed sounds coming from the direction the creature had gone, branches snapping, undergrowth rustling, and strangest of all, vocalizations unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Low, guttural tones that rose and fell in pitch, almost like speech, but no language I could identify. I wish I could say I bravely went to investigate, but the truth is, I was terrified. I turned and hurried back the way I had come, my earlier stealth forgotten as I crashed through the forest. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that massive shape emerging from the trees behind me, but nothing pursued me. I made it back to my truck in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I sped back towards town, my mind was racing. What had I seen? A bear walking on its hind legs, some unknown species, or could it have been the legendary Bigfoot? I never reported my experience officially. Who would believe me? I was afraid of being labeled a kook or attention seeker. But over the years, I've done a lot of research into Bigfoot sightings and encounters. So many details match what I saw that day: the height, the fur, the way it moved, even the vocalizations. To this day, I don't know for sure what I encountered on that lonely dirt road, but I know what I saw was real. It's made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. There are things out there in the wilderness that defy explanation, things that maybe we're not meant to fully understand. I still go hunting sometimes, but never alone anymore. And I always keep my eyes on the tree line, wondering if I'll ever catch another glimpse of that mysterious creature. The memory of our brief encounter is seared into my mind forever. It only lasted a few moments, but it changed my entire worldview. There are times I wish I could forget that day, go back to seeing the world as I did before. But then I remember the intelligence in those eyes, the quiet dignity of that massive being, and I feel privileged to have experienced something so profound, so outside the realm of everyday existence. Whatever it was, that creature was not simply an animal. There was an undeniable presence, an awareness that I've never encountered in any other living thing. It's a humbling reminder that there's so much we don't understand about this world we inhabit. I'm an old man now, and I know my days of trekking through the Alaskan wilderness are behind me. But sometimes on quiet nights, I find myself drawn to my back porch, gazing out at the distant forests. And I wonder, is it still out there? Are there others? Will we ever truly know the secrets that lurk in the shadows of our world? I may never have answers to those questions, but I'll never forget that crisp autumn day when my entire perception of reality shifted in the span of a few heartbeats. It serves as a constant reminder to keep an open mind, to never assume we know all there is to know. because sometimes truth is stranger than any fiction we could imagine. Story 25. It was late October, crisp autumn air with a nearly full moon. We figured the moonlight would be enough to see by, so we only brought a couple small flashlights. We met up around 11 p.m., threw on some warm layers, and headed out to the trailhead in my old Jeep. The woods were peaceful at first, just the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional hoot of an owl. We were joking around, talking about random stuff, not really paying much attention to our surroundings. After about an hour of hiking, that's when things started to get weird. I was bringing up the rear of our little group when I heard what sounded like a branch snapping somewhere behind us. I glanced back but didn't see anything in the shadows. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just some animal. But then it happened again, closer this time. "Hey guys, you hear that?" I called out. My friends stopped, and we all listened. For a few seconds there was total silence. Then we heard heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush, moving parallel to the trail. "Probably just a deer," said Mike, but he didn't sound too convinced. We continued on, a bit more alert now. Not 5 minutes later, something small and wet smacked into the back of my jacket. I yelped and spun around, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing there. I reached back and felt what had hit me. It was packed snow, like a snowball. "What the hell?" I muttered. There was no snow on the ground, and it definitely wasn't cold enough to be snowing. My friend Chris let out a startled "oof" as another snowball pelted him in the chest. We all started frantically looking around, but couldn't see anyone. The woods suddenly felt a lot darker and more menacing. "Okay, this isn't funny," yelled Mike. "Who's out there?" Silence. Then a low, rumbling growl from somewhere to our left. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Screw this. Let's get out of here," said Chris. We picked up the pace, no longer chatting as we hurried down the trail. I kept glancing behind us, convinced I could hear heavy footsteps following, always just out of sight. For the next hour or so, we alternated between speed walking and jogging, trying to put some distance between us and whatever was out there. But the sounds kept following, branches breaking, rocks being kicked, that weird growl. Sometimes it seemed like it was right beside us, other times further back. At one point, Mike swore he saw a massive dark shape move between two trees about 50 yards away. Chris thought he glimpsed glowing eyes reflecting our flashlight beams. I didn't see anything myself, but the noises were more than enough to freak me out. We came to a small clearing and stopped to catch our breath. That's when we realized we had no idea where we were. In our panic, we must have veered off the main trail onto some smaller game path. "Shit, I think we're lost," panted Chris, looking around wildly. Just then, an ear-splitting roar echoed through the trees, so loud it felt like it was inside my head. We all froze, eyes wide with terror. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, part bear, part mountain lion, but bigger and angrier than either. Without a word, we all took off running. I have no idea how long we ran for, crashing through undergrowth, leaping over fallen logs, branches whipping our faces. All I could think about was getting away from that sound. Finally, we burst out of the tree line onto the gravel road where we'd parked. We didn't stop running until we reached the Jeep, piling in and locking the doors. Mike fumbled with the keys, hands shaking as he tried to start the engine. As we peeled out of there, tires spitting gravel, I looked back at the dark wall of trees. For a split second, I swear I saw an enormous silhouette standing just inside the forest's edge, at least 8 feet tall, with long arms and glowing red eyes. Then we rounded a bend, and it was gone. We drove in complete silence for a while, all of us trying to process what had just happened. Finally, Chris spoke up. "Guys, I think that was a Bigfoot." Any other time, I would have laughed at him. But after what we'd experienced, I couldn't discount the possibility. Mike and our other friend Tom weren't convinced. They thought it was probably just some weirdo in the woods messing with us. But Chris and I knew deep down that it was something else. Something not entirely of this world. We got back to town around 3:30 a.m., completely rattled. None of us slept well for days afterwards. We tried to tell a few people about our experience, but most just rolled their eyes or assumed we were making it up. To this day, I'm not sure exactly what happened out there in those woods, but I know it was real, and it was terrifying. I've never felt so hunted, so prey-like in my entire life. Needless to say, I don't do night hikes anymore, and I always keep an eye on the tree line, half expecting to see that massive shape emerge from the shadows. I still have nightmares sometimes, flashes of glowing eyes, that bone-chilling roar, the feeling of being stalked by something ancient and powerful. Whatever it was, I hope I never encounter it again. But part of me wonders if it's still out there, waiting in the darkness of the forest for its next victim.